This is Audible.
Recorded Books and One-Click Digital present Where Serpents Sleep, a Sebastian St. Cyr mystery by C.S. Harris, narrated by Davina Porter. Who knows where serpents sleep? Anonymous. Chapter 1. Monday, 4th of May, 1812. The girl stared out the window, one hand sliding up and down her shawl-covered arm in a ceaseless, uneasy motion. Outside, a thick fog leached the light from the dying day and muffled the sounds of the surrounding city. "You don't like the fog, do you?" Hero Jarvis asked, watching her. They sat together in a pool of golden light thrown by the lamp on the plain tea-table where Hero had laid out her notebook, pen and ink, and the standard list of questions she'd drawn up to ask. The girl jerked her gaze back to Hero's face. This one was older than some of the other prostitutes Hero had interviewed, but still young, her face still smooth, her skin clear, her green eyes sharp with intelligence. She said her name was Rose Jones, although in Hero's experience, women in this business seldom gave their true names. "Who does like fog?" said Rose. "You can never tell what's out there." The girl's accent was disconcerting, pure Mayfair, without a trace of Cockney or any country inflection. Studying the girl's fine bone structure and graceful bearing, Hero knew a flicker of interest mingled with something both more personal and less admirable that she didn't care to examine too closely. How had this girl, surely no more than 18 or 19 years old and so obviously gently born and bred, ended up here at the Magdalen House, a refuge run by the Society of Friends for women who wished to leave prostitution? Reaching for her pen, Hero dipped the tip into her inkwell and asked, "How long have you been in the business?" A bitter smile touched Rose's lips. "You mean, how long have I been a whore? Less than a year." It was said to shock. But Hero Jarvis was not the kind of woman who shocked easily. At 25 years of age, she considered herself immune to the excesses of sensibility that afflicted so many of her sex. She simply nodded and went on to her next question. "What sort of work did you do before?" "Before? I didn't do anything before." "You lived with your family?" Rose tipped her head to one side, her gaze assessing the other woman in a way Hero did not like. "Why are you here, asking us these questions?" Hero cleared her throat. "I'm researching a theory." "What theory?" "It is my belief that most women enter prostitution, not because of some innate moral weakness, but out of economic necessity." A quiver of emotion crossed Rose's face, her voice coming out harsh. "What do you know about it? A woman like you." Hero set aside her pen and met Rose's gaze without flinching. "Are we so different?" Rose didn't answer. In the silence that followed, Hero could hear the voices of the other women drifting up from downstairs, a clink of cutlery, a quick burst of laughter. It grew late. Soon Hero's carriage would return to take her back to Berkeley Square, to the safety and comfort of her privileged world. Perhaps Rose was right, in a sense. Perhaps. The sound of a fist pounding on the front door below reverberated through the house. Hero heard a woman's startled exclamation mingled with a man's harsh growl. A cry of outrage turned suddenly to a scream of terror. Rose leapt from her chair, her eyes wild. "Oh, God, they found me!" Hero pushed to her feet. "What do you mean? What's happening?" She could hear the voices of more men now, the crash of overturned furniture, the smashing of crockery. Women shrieked. Someone pleaded, tearful, her voice trailing off into a whimper that ended abruptly. "They're here to kill me!" Rose whirled around, her gaze sweeping the room to fix on an old walnut cupboard which took up most of the near wall. "We must hide!" From below came the sound of running feet, and a woman's scream transformed hideously into a throaty gurgle. Rose yanked open the cupboard door. Hero reached out a hand, stopping her. "No, that's the first place they'll search." Crossing the room, Hero threw wide the casement window that overlooked the mist-swirled alley below. The window opened onto the sloping roof of what was probably the kitchen or a washroom. "This way," said Hero. She sucked in a quick breath, the damp, coal-smoke-tinged air biting her lungs as she threw one leg over the low sill and ducked her head through the frame. Covered with moss and condensation and soot, the slate roofing tiles felt treacherously slippery beneath the smooth leather soles of Hero's kid half-boots. She moved cautiously, one hand braced against the rough brick of the house wall as she turned to help Rose through the narrow opening. As she eased the window closed behind them, Hero heard a man shout from inside the house, "She's not here." Another man answered, his voice lower-pitched, his footsteps already heavy on the staircase. "She's here. She must be upstairs." "They're coming," Hero whispered, and felt Rose's hand tighten around her upper arm in warning. Following the direction of the girl's shaky, pointing finger, Hero discerned the figure of a man looming out of the fog below. A guard, stationed at the back door to make certain none of the women in the house escaped to the alley. Hunkering low, Hero crab-walked down the slippery slope of the roof to its edge. She watched the man below pace back and forth, his hat pulled over his eyes, his shoulders hunched against the dampness. Moving as silently as she could, Hero swung her feet over the edge, her stocking-clad legs showing creamy white against the white of the mist as the hem of her fine blue alpaca carriage dress caught on the edge of the tiles and hiked up. She waited until the guard paused just below her, then she pushed off from the eaves to drop straight down on him. The force of the impact knocked him to his knees, with a grunt, and threw Hero to one side. She landed on her hip in the mud, hard enough to bring a small cry to her lips, but she scrambled quickly to her feet. The man was still on his hands and knees when Hero's heel caught him hard on the side of his head and sent him staggering back against the house wall to land in a slumped heap. He lay still. Rose slid over the edge of the roof to come down in a rush of tearing petticoats and scraped skin. "Good heavens, where did you learn to do that?" "I used to play with my brother." The sound of the upstairs window being thrown open brought both their heads up. A man's voice cut through the fog. "Drummond, you there?" Rose grabbed Hero's hand, and they ran. They raced up an alleyway of mud and ancient half-buried cobbles hemmed in by soaring walls of soot-blackened brick. Breathing hard, her fingers gripping the other woman's hand tightly, Hero sprinted toward the square patch of white at the alley's mouth, where the silhouette of a carriage appeared out of the mist. They had almost reached the footpath when Hero heard the boom of a gun behind them. Beside her, Rose faltered. Turning, Hero caught the girl as she began to crumple. The bullet had torn a gaping, oozing hole through her chest. "Oh, no, no," Hero whispered. Rose's lips parted, spilling dark red blood down her chin. Hero could feel the girl's blood running warm and wet over her hands, see the light in Rose's eyes ebb, dim. "No!" The boom of a second shot echoed up the alleyway. Hero imagined she could feel its passing like the whisper of a ghost beside her cheek. "I'm sorry," she said, sobbing slightly as she eased Rose down into the mud and ran on. Chapter 2. Tuesday, 5th of May, 1812. The morning dawned overcast and unseasonably cool, the air heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the last lingering wisps of the fog. Winding westward toward the city, a lady's yellow-bodied carriage persistently shadowed a gentleman's curricle as he wove around tumble-down hackneys and towering drays driven by men in smocks and leather aprons. When they reached the Strand, the curricle's driver reined in before the last in a row of small, bow-fronted shops, his pair of blood chestnuts snorting and throwing their heads restless. Leaning forward, the lady signalled her own coachman to draw up. "They were hoping for a good run," said the gentleman's tiger from his perch at the curricle's rear, the sharp cockney tones of his voice carrying clearly in the damp air. "They'll get it soon enough," said the gentleman, handing the reins to the young groom. The gentleman's name was Sebastian St. Cyr, Viscount Devlin, the fourth child and youngest of 3 sons born to the Earl of Hendon and his Countess Sophia. He had only succeeded to the heir's title on the death of his 2 older brothers. Now, 9 and 20, the Viscount was said to have been badly affected by his experiences in the wars, although few in London seemed to know the exact nature of the circumstances that had led to his decision to sell his commission some 2 years before and return to England. Until the previous autumn, he had kept the famous actress Cat Boleyn as his mistress, but that liaison had ended abruptly for reasons also shrouded in mystery. The lady in the carriage watched as the Viscount hopped down from his curricle, his multi-caped driving coat swirling around him, his head falling back as he glanced up at the wooden sign with a dagger and a pair of crossed swords that swayed gently in the breeze. He was built tall and lean, with hair that was darker even than that of his father in his prime. But whereas the father's eyes were a piercing blue, the son's were a feral yellow that brought to mind the howl of wolves in the night. Once his lordship had made the apprehension of murderers his specialty, but for the past 8 months he had given himself over to drinking and gambling, and riding to hounds with a reckless abandon that seemed calculated to get him killed sometime in the very near future. The lady in the carriage watched as the Viscount entered the shop. "Wait here," she ordered her coachman, and signalled to the footman to let down the steps. Sebastian balanced the dagger in his hand and carefully tested its heft. It was a splendid piece, its ebony hilt inlaid with silver and brass in a delicate Moorish design. "It arrived just this week from Spain, my lord," said the shopkeeper, a short, rounded man with full rosy cheeks and a balding pate, who hovered behind the counter of his discreet little establishment in the Strand. "The finest Toledo steel, and the workmanship on the hilt is unusually exquisite, wouldn't you say?" Nodding, Sebastian whirled to send the dagger flying toward the dartboard on the shop's back wall. The blade bit just left of centre, quivered a moment, then stilled. The shopkeeper's hands fluttered in dismay. Devlin never missed. "Obviously there is an unseen flaw. Let me show you another." "No, the blade flew true." Sebastian rubbed his eyes with a splayed thumb and forefinger, aware of a faint tremor in his hand, born of too many sleepless nights, too many bottles of brandy, too many dinners left uneaten. "I'll take it." He was reaching for his purse when the bell on the door jangled, and a gentlewoman in an ostrich-plumed hat and a hunter-green pelisse entered the shop, bringing with her the scent of the cool spring morning. She was a tall woman, just past the first blush of youth, with light brown hair she wore pulled straight back in an unflattering style that accentuated the aquiline nose she had inherited from her father, Charles, Lord Jarvis, cousin to the king and the acknowledged power behind Prinny's fragile regency. She nodded in response to the shopkeeper's effusive greetings, but turned her frank grey stare on Sebastian. "I see your curricle is waiting outside, the one with the matched chestnuts, and a tiger who looks no more than 12. Sebastian returned his attention to the business of counting out the requisite number of banknotes. "I believe Tom is 13. Why? Has he lifted your purse?" She raised one eyebrow in an expression he found unpleasantly evocative of her father at his most arrogant and ruthless. "He's a pickpocket?" "He used to be." "How original." She cleared her throat. "I would like to take a ride around the park." Sebastian studied Hero Jarvis's hostile, determined face. He had no illusions about how this woman felt about him. She'd given it as her opinion on more than one occasion that he ought to be arrested, or else summarily shot. "I take it this is my cue to invite you for a drive." "Thank you." She swept toward the door. "I'll await you in your curricle." His curiosity piqued. Sebastian walked out of the shop a few minutes later to find Miss Jarvis sitting on the high seat of his curricle, a furled parasol at her side, the reins in her own capable hands. Sebastian's tiger was nowhere in sight, although he could see Miss Jarvis's elegant town carriage waiting up near the corner. Its driver looked asleep. "Where's Tom?" Sebastian demanded, leaping up beside her to take the reins. "I told him he wasn't wanted." "Two things," Sebastian said evenly, giving his chestnuts the office to start. "I don't like other people handling my horses, and I tolerate no one giving false orders to my servants." "There was no falsehood involved. I didn't want him." She opened her parasol with a snap and tilted it toward the feeble sunshine. "And while I understand your sentiments about the horses, once I had eliminated your tiger, there really was no other option now, was there?" "Miss Jarvis," he said, his voice coming out in a grating rasp, "in the last 18 months your father has attempted to have me killed, and very nearly destroyed someone close to me. Why are we taking this drive?" "He attempted to have you killed? It is my understanding that you threatened to kill him." "Several times," Sebastian agreed, turning in through the gates to Hyde Park. "And you kidnapped me," she reminded him. "Along with your maid," he agreed, "but only briefly. Which brings us back to the question, why are you here?" "Last night, a group of unidentified men attacked the Magdalen house near Covent Garden. They killed over 6 women and set fire to the house." The Magdalen house was not a subject generally discussed in mixed company. Sebastian cast her a quick glance before returning his gaze deliberately to his horses. "I knew the refuge had burned," he said, "but I don't recall hearing anything about the house being attacked." "It's much easier for Bow Street to dismiss the fire as an accident." Her lip curled. "After all, the victims were only women of ill repute." "How do you know the fire wasn't an accident?" "Because I was there, in the house. One of the women and I escaped through a window and ran down the alley." There was a moment's silence while he digested this. She said, "You haven't asked why I was there." "Very well, Miss Jarvis. Why were you there?" "I've been conducting research for a bill to be presented in Parliament at the next session for the relief of indigent women. Centuries of sanctimonious moralists and ministers thundering from their pulpits have convinced society that women become prostitutes because they suffer from some innate moral depravity. I, on the other hand, believe that the unpalatable truth is most women enter the profession only as a last desperate resort. Unable to earn a living wage by any of the other means our society makes available to them, they soon realize they can either steal, sell their bodies, or starve." Sebastian glanced at her tightly held face. It seemed an unlikely subject to stir the passions of Lord Jarvis's daughter. But then Sebastian really knew little about this woman. "What happened to the girl you say escaped with you?" "She was shot and killed before we reached the street. Fortunately, I'd left my maid in the carriage. She's so sour and censorious she tends to discourage the women from talking. Otherwise, I've no doubt she would have been killed as well." Sebastian stared off across the park, considering this. It was an unfashionable hour for a drive. Except for a middle-aged man in a shabby gig teaching a half-grown boy to drive, the gravel road lay deserted in the fitful morning sunshine. After a moment, Sebastian said, "You'll have to forgive me, Miss Jarvis, if I find all this rather difficult to believe. You see, it seems to me that if anyone had dared take a shot at Lord Jarvis's daughter last night, every magistrate and constable in England would be out even as we speak, scouring the back alleys and flash houses of the city until those responsible were brought to justice." She twitched her parasol back and forth in short, sharp jerks, a tinge of angry colour touching her cheeks. "My father was disconcerted at the prospect my presence at the Magdalen house might become public knowledge." "Disconcerted?" said Sebastian, arching one eyebrow. "Disconcerted," she said again, with emphasis. "Given Lord Jarvis's attitude toward social reform, I suspect dismayed might be a more fitting description." "My father understands that my politics are different from his. Sebastian simply smiled. "He has requested Sir William Hadley personally take charge of the investigation," she said.
"Then you may rest easy. As the Chief Magistrate of Bow Street, Sir William has proved himself to be crude, ruthless, and very effective."
"I fear I haven't made myself clear. Sir William has been ordered to make certain that there is no official investigation, as any such inquiries would inevitably lead to my name being bandied about in connection with the incident. Instead, my father intends to take care of the men responsible himself. He wants it done quietly, very quietly."
"Lord Jarvis is highly effective at taking care of people quietly," said Sebastian. "I don't think you need concern yourself with the matter any further."
"My father's sole interest is in killing those who endangered my life."
"And that's not sufficient."
She turned toward him, her grey eyes as intelligent and inscrutable as her father's. "One of the women I interviewed last night was called Rose Jones. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years of age, tall and slender, with brown hair and green eyes. I would swear she was well-born, very well-born."
"She may have been. Unfortunately, Miss Jarvis, gently born women are frequently reduced by circumstances to prostitution."
Sebastian completed his second circuit of the park in silence, then turned back toward the Strand.
"Clergymen's daughters, daughters of impoverished solicitors and doctors, the widows and orphans of officers killed in the war, all are far more common in Covent Garden than you obviously imagine."
"That may be. But when we first heard those men breaking into the Magdalen house last night, Rose said to me, 'Oh God, they've found me. They're here to kill me.' Then later I heard the men say, 'She's not here, and she must be upstairs.' I believe Rose Jones is the reason those women were killed. I want to know who she was, and why those men were after her."
"Why?"
"Why?" The question appeared to surprise her.
"Yes. Why do you want to know? Vulgar curiosity."
"No."
"Then what?"
She was silent for a moment, the damp breeze ruffling her plain brown hair as she stared off across the misty parkland. She drew in a deep breath that flared her nostrils, then said, "I held that woman in my arms as she was dying. It could so easily have been me. I suppose I feel I owe her something." It was a heartfelt performance, and if it had been delivered by anyone other than Jarvis's daughter, Sebastian probably would have believed it. He said,
"So why precisely have you sought me out?"
She turned to face him, the hint of humanity he thought he'd momentarily glimpsed, now gone. "It's the oddest thing, but I've realized that none of my acquaintances have much experience with murder, so naturally I thought of you." Sebastian was startled into letting out a sharp laugh. Something unpleasant gleamed in her eyes. "I amuse you, my lord?"
If truth were told, Hero Jarvis scared the hell out of him.
Sebastian shook his head, but all he said was,
"I may have been involved in several investigations in the past, Miss Jarvis, but apprehending murderers is not my hobby."
"What would you call it, then? Your avocation?" Cat Boleyn had once called it his passion, his obsession, his self-imposed penance for sins she only half understood. But that seemed a lifetime ago now, and he slammed his mind shut against the thought. He said,
"I haven't been involved in anything of that nature for a while now."
"I have heard something of how you've been spending your time these past months," she said dryly. "Rest assured that I'm not asking you to investigate personally. I'm merely requesting guidance on how I should go about beginning such an investigation."
"It's your intention to investigate these murders yourself?"
"Are you implying that I am incapable?"
"I'm implying that women of your station generally hire Bow Street runners to do their investigating."
"That's not possible in this situation."
"Because of Sir William?"
"Not exactly." A flush crept up her cheeks, and he wondered what she was not telling him. "I promised my father I would not approach the magistrates," He studied her carefully composed features.
"Yet Lord Jarvis has no objection to you pursuing your own inquiries."
She turned her head away to study a passing row of shops, and Sebastian gave a low laugh.
"You haven't told him, have you? He will find out."
Lord Jarvis maintained an extensive network of spies and agents which had earned the man a well-deserved reputation for omniscience. She said, "I have no intention of denying my activities." Sebastian knew a brief flicker of admiration. There weren't many with the courage to cross the king's powerful cousin. He said,
"You also realize that I could use the information you've given me to hurt you."
"You mean to hurt my father through me?" She met his gaze and held it. "It has occurred to me. It's a risk I've decided I'm willing to take."
"Discovering this woman's identity is that important to you?"
"I don't think anything has ever been this important to me," she said simply. A tense silence fell between them. He had a dozen good reasons for avoiding this woman, and very few incentives to help her.
Yes, the temptation to annoy Jarvis was powerful, yet that in itself might not have been enough to tempt him if he hadn't been aware of a vague, unexpected quickening of interest. He couldn't think of anything that had really intrigued him, for 8 months now. He reined in beside her carriage and said, "If it were me, Miss Jarvis, I'd begin by talking to the authorities. See what they have discovered so far." For the first time since she had approached him that morning, he saw what looked like a slight faltering in her formidable composure. "But that's the one thing I can't do." "No, but I can."
"You? But why would you involve yourself in this?"
"You know why."
She met his gaze, and in that moment he realized that she did indeed know why. She knew he would welcome any chance to discomfit her father. More than that, she had, in fact, been counting on it. "Thank you, my lord," she said, allowing herself a slight smile as she turned to alight. "You will tell me if you discover anything?"
"Of course,"
said Sebastian, and went in search of his tiger. Chapter 3. Sebastian found Tom waiting for him outside the cutler's shop. A small scrap of a boy with brown hair, a gap-toothed smile, and a usefully forgettable face. Tom served Sebastian as both a groom and a willing participant in some of Sebastian's less orthodox activities.
"She said I weren't wanted,"
the tiger exclaimed when Sebastian told him of Miss Jarvis's deception.
"How was I to know a starchy gentlewoman like her was telling a bouncer?"
Miss Jarvis would argue that technically it wasn't a bouncer, since she did not want your presence.
Tom's brows drew together in a dark frown that augured ill for any future encounters between the tiger and Lord Jarvis's formidable daughter. Hiding a smile, Sebastian gathered his reins.
"I want you to take a message to Dr. Gibson for me. You'll probably find him at the Chalk Street Almshouse. I think he volunteers there on Tuesday mornings. Ask him to meet me at the site of the Friends Magdalen house in Covent Garden. I'll be there as soon as I've spoken to Sir Henry."
"The Magdalen house?"
Tom's eyes danced with sudden interest.
"Ain't that the place what burned last night?"
"That's right."
"You think there's something not quite right about that fire?"
"Miss Jarvis claims it was murder."
Sebastian found Sir Henry Lovejoy, Chief Magistrate at Queen Square Public Office, sitting at his desk reading the Hue and Cry.
"My lord,"
said Sir Henry, surging to his feet when the clerk Collins ushered Sebastian into the chamber.
"Please, come in and sit down."
A small man, with a bald head and reading glasses, Sir Henry had been a merchant before the deaths of his wife and daughter shifted his interest to the law. They were unlikely friends, Sebastian and this earnest magistrate, with his serious demeanour and steadfast adherence to a rigid moral code worthy of a preacher. But friends they were.
"What can you tell me about last night's fire at the Magdalen house?"
Sebastian asked, taking the seat Sir Henry indicated. Sir Henry peeled the small gold-framed spectacles from his face and rubbed the bridge of his nose.
Terrible business, that. Last I heard, they'd already pulled 4 bodies from the rubble, and there are probably more. According to the Quakers who run the place, 7 soiled doves were staying at the establishment at the time of the tragedy, in addition to the woman in charge of the day-to-day operation of the house, a matron named Margaret Crowley. She apparently took refuge with a friend some 10 years ago herself, and recently came back to help. She's believed to be one of the victims.
Any sign the women might have been killed before the fire was set?
You mean murdered?
Sir Henry had an almost comically high voice, and it now rose even higher.
Good heavens, no.
Sebastian frowned.
How many survivors were there?
None that I know of.
You don't find that strange? That none of the women managed to escape the fire? It was only, 5, 6 o'clock in the evening when the fire broke out?
Sir Henry lifted his thin shoulders in a shrug.
The house was old and its timbers dry. It would have burned quickly. People frequently assume they have more time to get out than they actually do. They become disoriented and they perish.
It was possible, Sebastian supposed, but he found it difficult to believe that none of those 8 women had managed to stagger out of the smoke and flames into the night.
Bow Street is handling the investigation, I assume?
He asked casually. Sir Henry nodded.
It's not far from their offices, after all. I believe Lord Jarvis has requested Sir William take charge of the incident personally.
Lord Jarvis? What's his interest in this? Sebastian asked, curious to hear what the magistrate would say.
Sir Henry looked mildly surprised, as if the question hadn't occurred to him.
No one queried Lord Jarvis's activities.
That I do not know.
And has Sir William ordered post-mortems on the women?
I don't believe so, no. Last I'd heard, the bodies were to be turned over to the Friends for burial. Sir Henry was looking troubled. After a moment he said, "If I might be so bold as to inquire into your interest in this, my lord?" Sebastian pushed to his feet.
I have no interest in it. I'm simply making inquiries on behalf of an acquaintance.
He turned toward the door, but paused to look back and ask,
You haven't by any chance heard of a young prostitute named Rose Jones, have you? 18, maybe 19 years of age? Well born.
Sir Henry thought a moment, then shook his head.
No. You think she was one of the victims?
She might have been.
Who was she?
That's the problem, said Sebastian. I don't know. Chapter 4.
We received reports this morning that the Luddites have burned another cotton mill in the West Riding,
said the Right Honourable Spencer Percival, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. A small thin man with a perpetually earnest expression, the Prime Minister paced nervously across the carpeted floor of the Carlton House chambers, kept by Charles, Lord Jarvis.
So I had heard,
said Jarvis, going to stand beside the window overlooking them all. He was a big man in every sense of the word. Tall of stature and wide through the shoulders, he carried perhaps twice the weight of the Prime Minister. He was also easily twice as powerful and infinitely more cunning. The reports from Jarvis's own agents in Yorkshire had reached his desk the previous evening.
Fortunately,
continued Percival, still pacing back and forth,
by some miracle, the local militia arrived quickly enough to arrest some score or more of the participants. We believe they're the same men involved in smashing trains last month.
It was no miracle, merely the careful planting of agent provocateurs.
The Prime Minister spun to face him.
You have infiltrated the movement?
Did you think I would sit idly by while masked ruffians hamper the industrial production of this country, and gather at night on the moors to practice drills and manoeuvres like a bunch of bloodthirsty French revolutionaries? We have more troops fighting the Luddites here in England than we have against Napoleon in Iberia. I understand that the Prince is reluctant to move against his own people, but the time has come to put a stop to this nonsense.
"It's not just in Yorkshire," said Percival. "There are also indications that some of the workers in Lancashire—"
Jarvis made a rough noise deep in his throat. "Execute a dozen of these Yorkshire lads and transport a few hundred to Botany Bay, and your Lancashire louts will think twice before they go smashing any more machines."
The Prime Minister looked troubled.
"Yes, I suppose so. Still, agents provocateurs—" "It's on my conscience, not yours," said Jarvis dryly. "And if you are worried it will distress the Prince, we simply won't tell him."
"Yes, that might be for the best." Jarvis turned back to the papers spread across his desk.
"If there's nothing else."
"What?"
"Oh, no. Good day, my lord,"
said the Prime Minister, and bowed himself out. Jarvis stood beside his desk, his thoughts drifting away from the Prime Minister and the Prince and the Luddites to matters of a more personal nature. The descendant of an old and powerful family, Jarvis owned a large and prosperous estate, as well as a comfortable townhouse on Berkeley Square. But he generally avoided his own houses as much as possible, passing most of his time either in his clubs or in the chambers kept both here at Carlton House and in St. James's Palace. The Berkeley Square house was overrun with females, and Jarvis had little patience for members of the fair sex, least of all his half-witted wife, or his grasping harridan of a mother. Once, Jarvis had had a son, David. The boy had seemed a disappointment at the time, although Jarvis had since come to realize that he might have been able to make something of David had he lived. Instead, Jarvis had been left with only his daughter, Hero. The mere thought of her now was enough to bring a sour burn to his chest. If she had been a boy, then he would have been proud of her powerful will and her undeniable intelligence. But he'd left her too much in the care of her half-mad mother, who had exercised no control over the girl whatsoever. As a result, she'd grown up with a collection of ideas that could only be described as radical. As for this latest start of hers, well, at least she'd had the sense to come to him first rather than bolting straight to Bow Street. He could handle Sir William. All that remained was to tidy up the loose ends. Jarvis was very good at tidying up loose ends. Jarvis might have owned his introduction to court to his distant kinship to George III, but it was his incomparable intellect combined with the formidable strength of his will and his cunning that had made him indispensable first to the king, then to the regent. The position of Prime Minister could have been his in an instant, had he wanted it. He did not want it, being content to leave the nominal governance of the country to men such as Spencer Perceval and the Earl of Hendon. None understood better than Jarvis the limitations of power politics. He found it far more satisfying and lucrative to exercise power from the shadows. There was no one more powerful in all of England than Jarvis. But then there was no one in England more fiercely devoted to his king and his country. For the sake of England and the dynasty that ruled her, Jarvis would do anything. A scratching at the door brought his head around. A pale-faced clerk bowed and said, "Colonel Bryce Ibsen to see you, my lord." "Send him in." Hat in hand, the colonel advanced halfway into the room and sketched a low bow. "You wish to see me, sir?" The colonel was a tall man, not quite as tall as Jarvis, but superbly muscled with dark hair and grey eyes. A former cavalry officer, Epsom Smith, had now served Jarvis for more than 3 years. Of all Jarvis's agents, he was the most intelligent and the most ruthless. Jarvis drew an enamelled snuff-box from his pocket and opened it with one flick of his finger. "Last night someone killed a half-dozen whores at a house of refuge run by the Society of Friends near Covent Garden. I want you to find out who did it and kill them." A flicker of surprise passed across the colonel's normally impassive features. "The Regent has an interest in the incident?" Jarvis lifted a pinch of snuff to one nostril and sniffed. "It's a personal matter." Colonel Epsom Smith inclined his head. "I'll get on it right away, sir." Discreetly, of course.
Of course. Epsom Smith bowed again and withdrew. Chapter 5. Long before he reached what was left of the Magdalen house in Covent Garden, Sebastian could smell the fetid odour of old smoke hanging heavy in the cool air. The house had collapsed in on itself, leaving only a smouldering, burned-out husk of blackened bricks and charred timbers. 3 men with dampened hides wrapped around their boots, and cloths covering the lower part of their faces were carefully raking their way through the ruins. A small crowd of ragged women and children had gathered at a nearby corner to watch, their faces drawn and solemn. Even the baker's boy was silent, his tray of cooling buns hanging forgotten from its band around his neck. Sebastian spotted Paul Gibson crouched awkwardly beside a small body in a ripped, stained gown of yellow cotton. 6 more bodies lay in a neat row along the footpath. 4 of the bodies looked badly burned, their skin blistered and black, their faces charred beyond identification. But a couple of the women had obviously been sheltered by falling debris, their bodies battered and scorched, but still recognizable. Hunkering down beside his friend, Sebastian found himself staring at a young girl, a slim form relatively untouched by the fire. She couldn't have been more than 13 or 14 years of age, her face still full-cheeked and childlike, her corn-silk, fine, fair hair fluttering gently in the smoke-tinged breeze. But what drew Sebastian's attention, and held it, was the ripped and bloodied bodice of her simple muslin gown.
"Could that have been done by a falling timber?" he asked.
Paul Gibson shook his head.
"No. She was stabbed with a knife. There, in the side," he pointed, "and several times here in the chest."
"Bloody hell," said Sebastian softly. "She was right."
"Who was right?"
Gibson glanced up at him.
"Did someone survive this?" "So it would seem."
Sebastian nodded toward that long, silent row.
"What about the others?"
His lips compressing into a thin line, Paul Gibson turned his head to follow Sebastian's gaze. The Irishman had spent years as an army surgeon dealing with all the unspeakable horrors of a battlefield's carnage. He now taught at St. Thomas's, in addition to keeping a small surgery near the tower. But despite it all, Sebastian knew that any premature or violent death still troubled Gibson. It was why, late at night in the small secluded building at the base of his unkempt garden, he could frequently be found, exploring the mysteries of life and death with the help of a series of cadavers culled from the city's untended churchyards. No one in London could read a dead body better than Paul Gibson.
"The others are much the same," said Gibson.
He lurched to his feet, stumbling slightly as his one remaining good leg took his weight. He'd lost the lower part of his other leg to a French cannonball.
"Several are so badly burned it would be impossible to say how they died without a proper post-mortem. But I found at least 1 more that was stabbed, and another who had her throat slit." "Could any of them have been shot?"
"Actually, yes. The woman at the far end was definitely shot."
"How did you know?"
Sebastian stared at that distant, blackened form.
"Is she identifiable?" "Maybe by her mother, although I wouldn't want her mother to have to remember her looking like this."
Gibson glanced around as a hoarse shout went up from one of the men working through the smouldering ruins.
"Looks like they found another one," said Gibson. "That makes 8.
Sebastian blew out a long, slow breath.
Jesus.
He watched as 2 men stumbled out of the ruins, a makeshift stretcher carried between them.
"This un here's in bad shape,"
said one of the men, as they eased their burden down on the footpath.
"Please God it's the last."
Gibson hunkered down beside the charred, blackened form, but said,
"This one's so burned that even with a proper autopsy—" "Get away from that body!"
Sebastian looked up to find a tall, bear-like gentleman in an exaggerated top hat and red and white striped silk waistcoat descending upon them from a lumbering dray. Sir William Hadley,
one of Bow Street's 3 stipendiary magistrates, came puffing up to them, his jaw jutting forward like a man ready for a fight. "What do you think you're doing? Didn't you hear what I said? Get away from that body."
Gibson pushed slowly to his feet. "I'm a surgeon."
"A surgeon? Who gave you permission to examine these bodies? I've ordered no post-mortem. Don't try to tell me one of the families requested it, because I won't believe it. Whores don't have families, leastways none that'll acknowledge them."
The Irishman's dark brows drew together in a frown.
"Nevertheless, a post-mortem is called for, Sir William. These women were murdered." "Murdered?" The Bow Street magistrate let out a harsh laugh. "What are you talking about? This wasn't murder. These women died in a fire. Someone left a candle too close to a curtain, or let a hot ember fall from the hearth."
"And how do you explain the stab wounds?"
"Stab wounds? What stab wounds?"
"At least 2 of these women were stabbed, while one had her throat."
Sir William swiped his massive arm through the air in a dismissive gesture. "Enough of this. I will not have my office's resources diverted to investigate the death of a bunch of strumpets. You think the good citizens of this city care if there are 6 or so fewer trollops walking the streets?"
Sebastian nodded toward the body of the fair-headed girl lying at the end of the row.
"I think her mother might care." "If she had a mother who cared, she wouldn't have become cash on the hoof."
Sir William paused a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sebastian.
"I know you. You're Lord Hendon's son."
"That's right." Hot colour flooded the magistrate's big fleshy face.
"This is none of your affair. You hear me? I don't care if your father is Chancellor of the Exchequer. I won't have you meddling in this investigation."
Sebastian said,
"I didn't realize there was an investigation for me to meddle in."
Sir William's face was so dark now it looked purple. He thrust a meaty finger inches from Sebastian's nose.
"I'm warning you, my lord. Keep out of this, or I'll have you arrested, Pier's son or not."
The magistrate stomped away to go bark orders at the men searching the ruins. Gibson stared after him, but Sebastian was more interested in the elegant town carriage drawing up at the corner, its liveried footman hastening to open the carriage door.
"Who's that?"
said Gibson, following his friend's gaze. A tall gentlewoman in a smart pelisse had appeared in the open doorway, the ostrich plume in her hat waving in the cool breeze as she waited for the footman to let down the steps.
"That,"
said Sebastian, "is Miss Hero Jarvis."
"Lord Jarvis's daughter? Why is she here?" "She's the woman who survived the fire." "Miss Jarvis? What in God's name was she doing at the Magdalen house?"
"Research," said Sebastian, and went to hand the lady down from her carriage. Chapter 6. "I expected I might find you here," said Miss Jarvis. She accepted Sebastian's assistance down, then released his hand immediately and took a step back. Within the shadowy interior of her carriage, he could see a maid waiting primly with both hands clasped before her. "That is Paul Gibson, is it not?" said Miss Jarvis, gazing beyond him to where Gibson stood beside the curricle talking to a glowering Tom. "The surgeon?"
"You know him?"
"I attended several of his lectures at St. Thomas's, on the circulatory system, and on human musculature." It was the last thing Sebastian would have expected her to have done, but he kept the thought to himself. "Frankly," she said, "I'm surprised to see him here. I didn't think Sir William planned to order autopsies."
"He hasn't. Gibson's here because he's a friend of mine."
She glanced up at him. "And has he discovered anything?"
"He says the women were murdered. Most were stabbed, although he thinks at least one was shot."
She opened her parasol and raised it against the feeble sun. "You doubted me, did you?"
"Yes."
She nodded, as if she had expected as much. In the street before the house, Sir William was now busy supervising the loading of that sad row of charred bodies into the back of the dray. She watched him for a moment, then said, "Has Dr. Gibson's opinion prompted Sir William to order the women autopsied?"
"No. I suspect we can thank your father for that."
She shook her head. "I doubt it would have happened, even without my father's interference. Sir William's attitude toward prostitutes is well known. Last month a costermonger came before the magistrates for beating a woman to death in St. Paul's churchyard. Sir William let the man go with only a warning." Sebastian studied her clear-skinned face.
"Why are you here, Miss Jarvis?"
The breeze fluttered her hair across her face, but she pushed it back without a hint of artifice. "I've been talking to the Society of Friends. It seems a gentleman by the name of Joshua Walden was at the Magdalen House the night Rose first sought refuge with them. He lives in Hanstown. I thought he might be able to tell us more about her."
"Us?"
Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and rocked back on his heels.
"I was under the impression that this was your investigation, Miss Jarvis. That my role was that of an adviser only, and was rapidly coming to a conclusion."
She tilted her head back, one hand coming up to hold her hat, as she stared up at the crumbling, smoke-darkened walls of the Magdalen House. Something quivered across her face, a breath of painful emotion that was there, and then gone. "That was mere subterfuge, and you know it. I want to find out who killed these women, Lord Devlin, and why, and I am not too vain to acknowledge that you are far more experienced in such matters than I. I was hoping that if you looked into the incident, even briefly, it would catch your interest." When he made no response, she said, "Do you believe in justice?"
"As an abstract concept, yes, although I fear there is little true justice in this world."
She nodded toward the blackened ruins of the Magdalen House. "In life, our society failed Rose, failed all these women. I don't want to fail them in death."
"You are not responsible for society."
"Yes, I am. We all are, each in our own small way." She turned to fix him with a direct gaze. "Will you come with me to Hanstown?" He started to say no, but as he looked into her fierce grey eyes, he realized that a part of her actually wanted him to say no, because it would give her an excuse to walk away from all of this, away from the fear and the horror that was that night. Turning, he watched the workmen swing the body of the young, fair-headed girl into the back of the dray. And in that moment, he wasn't thinking about Lord Jarvis or Hero Jarvis. He was thinking about the life that child would never live, and the men who had taken it from her. And so he surprised both himself and Hero Jarvis by saying,
"Yes."
Chapter 7. Joshua Walden's home in Hanstown proved to be a modest house of red brick, with neatly painted white shutters, a shiny black door, and window boxes filled with well-tended masses of dianthus and saxifrage. A tall, almost cadaverously thin man in his late 40s or early 50s, with a thick head of greying brown hair, he received them in a plainly furnished parlour.
"I am honoured by this visit, Hero Jarvis," he said, inviting them to sit. "Honoured. I read thine article on the high rate of mortality amongst children sold by the parish as climbing boys to chimney-sweeps. Fascinating work."
"Why, thank you," said Miss Jarvis, giving the Quaker a smile so wide it made Sebastian blink. "Although I must confess, the methodology used was not my own." From his seat beside the empty hearth, Sebastian listened, bemused, while Miss Jarvis worked deliberately and adroitly to insinuate herself in their host's good graces. The two crusaders rattled on at length about everything from laying in hospitals to poor laws. Only gradually did she bring the conversation around, artfully, to the reason for their visit. "I understand you were at the Magdalen House the night Rose Jones sought refuge there," she said.
"Yes, it was the third night."
"The third night?" said Sebastian. Walden smiled.
"What thee would call Wednesday."
I remember it because the weather was dreadful. The rain was coming down in sheets and it was quite cold. We haven't been having much of a spring, have we? The poor women were soaked through and dangerously chilled.
Sebastian sat forward.
Women? Yes, there were 2 of them. I don't recall the other one's name, Helen or Hannah, something like that. She didn't stay long, I'm afraid. Our rules are not harsh, but they are firm. We've discovered that some of the women who come to us don't really wish to leave the life. I'm afraid Helen or Hannah or whoever she was fell into that category. She was frightened the night she came, but that soon wore off. She left after only a day or 2.
Miss Jarvis nodded, neither embarrassed nor shocked by the nature of the conversation. You say she was frightened?
Oh, yes, they both were. It's not unusual. Many of the women who come to us are fleeing dreadful situations, virtual slavery, you know. The brutes who keep them have either forced them to sign papers the poor simpletons believe are binding, or have contrived to reduce them to a state of hopeless indebtedness, even renting them the very clothes on their backs, so that by fleeing they open themselves up to charges of theft. Did she give you any idea what kind of situation she'd fled? Sebastian asked. We generally don't inquire too closely into such details, but from 1 or 2 things Hannah— yes, that was the other girl's name, Hannah, not Helen. At any rate, from 1 or 2 things she let slip, Margaret Crowley received the impression the women had been at a residential brothel.
He paused, his thin chest rising on a sigh.
Margaret Crowley was the matron at the Magdalen House, you know.
Miss Jarvis leaned forward to pat his hand where it lay on the chair's arm.
Yes, I'm so sorry. Any idea where the brothel may have been located? Sebastian asked.
Walden cleared his throat.
The one girl, Hannah, was very talkative. I believe she mentioned Portman Square.
Sebastian nodded. Closed, stay-in brothels were rare in London. More common were lodging-house brothels, where the girls were, nominally at least, independent, picking up their customers from the pleasure gardens or the theatre or even the streets of the city. They then brought them back to the lodging-house where they kept a room. Other girls took their men to accommodation houses, where they didn't actually live. They simply hired one of its rooms for the requisite number of hours or minutes. Others made use of the numerous chop-houses, cigar-rooms, and coffee-houses that also had bedrooms available for use, their exclusively male clientele making them good hunting grounds as well. I'm afraid there's really not much else I can tell you about Rose Jones, Walden was saying. Many of the girls chafe at the restrictions we impose upon them, but Rose never did. She never left the house. Because she was still afraid? Yes, I think so. Did she ever say anything about her life before she— Miss Jarvis hesitated.
Walden shook his head. No, although it was obvious she was gently born. We don't often see women quite like her. For some reason, many of the women who come to us claim to be clergymen's daughters, although I suspect few actually are. But I've no doubt Rose was very well born indeed.
He looked from Miss Jarvis to Sebastian.
This has something to do with the fire, doesn't it? Dost thou think it's possible the fire was not an accident? I think so, yes.
Joshua Walden nodded, his lips pressed together tightly.
It was when he was escorting them to the door that he said suddenly, "There is one thing more that might help. We had a young girl in the house who called herself Rachel. I don't think she could have been more than 13, lovely, fair-haired child. One evening, just by chance, I overheard Rose say to the child, 'I was once called Rachel.' It stuck in my head because Rachel laughed merrily and said, 'I was once called Rose.'"
He smiled gently at the memory, the smile rapidly fading.
"But it may mean nothing. Some girls change their names frequently."
"Perhaps," said Sebastian, pausing in the Quaker's simple entrance hall.
"But it could also be Rose's real name."
"Thank you." "That was fortuitous," said Miss Jarvis, as Sebastian handed her up into her waiting carriage. "I hadn't expected to learn so much."
"You think we learned a great deal, do you?"
"You don't?" She turned to look at him in surprise. "How many brothels can there be near Portman Square?" He took a step back.
"Believe it or not, Miss Jarvis, I haven't the slightest idea. But I know someone who will."
Chapter 8. In addition to the modest estate in Hampshire bequeathed to him by a maiden great-aunt, Sebastian also kept a bow-fronted house in Brook Street. The establishment at number 41 Brook Street was considerably smaller and less imposing than the Grosvenor Square townhouse of his father, Alistair Sincere, Chancellor of the Exchequer and 5th Earl of Hendon. But Sebastian had not visited either his father's Grosvenor Square house or his ancestral estates in Cornwall since September of the previous year. A distant rumble of thunder shook the cloudy afternoon as Sebastian took the short flight of stairs to his own front door. He handed his hat to his majordomo, Maury, and said,
"Where is Calhoun?"
Jules Calhoun was Sebastian's valet. The less-than-orthodox nature of some of Sebastian's activities had, in the past, made it difficult for him to retain the services of a gentleman's gentleman. But it had been 8 months now since Calhoun had joined the Brook Street household, and he'd never shown the least tendency to leave in horror or a fit of pique. The majordomo, however, was not one of Calhoun's fans. He sniffed.
"Some valets might have more sense than to invade the kitchen as close to the dinner hour," said Murray in sepulchral tones. "Unfortunately, Calhoun is not of their company."
Sebastian hid a smile.
"Brewing boot polish, is he?"
A muscle bunched along Murray's tight jaw.
"If Madame Leclerc should quit over this—"
"Madame Leclerc quit because Calhoun has chosen to spend some time in the kitchen?" Sebastian jerked off his gloves.
"Not likely."
Madame Leclerc would have banished any other valet with a pot of boot polish to the stables. But the cook was called Madame solely out of courtesy. She was actually a young Frenchwoman in her late 20s, a softly rounded woman with black hair and laughing eyes and a short upper lip. And Jules Calhoun was a very dashing gentleman's gentleman. Murray sniffed again.
"Would you like me to have him wait upon you, my lord?"
Sebastian swung off his driving coat.
"Good God, no."
Boot polish was serious business.
"I'll go to him."
Murray bowed in majestic silence and withdrew. The descent of the Viscount into his own kitchens caused something of a flutter. The kitchen maid dropped a pot of half-shelled peas, while Madame Leclerc gasped and said, "Is something wrong, my lord? You did not like the sole I fixed for last night's dinner, perhaps?"
"The sole was wonderful,"
said Sebastian, carefully avoiding the cascade of rolling peas.
"I've come to discuss boot polish with Calhoun, if you'll excuse us."
Madame Leclerc threw a soulful glance at the small, lithe man stirring the contents of a heavy pot on the stove, and withdrew. The air in the kitchen was redolent with the scent of hot beeswax and resin. In deference to the stove's heat, Jules Calhoun had removed his coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, yet he still managed to convey a sense of punctilious neatness. Nothing about either his demeanour or his impressive skills as a gentleman's gentleman betrayed the fact that he had grown up in the most notorious flash house in London.
"As keen as your lordship is about the shine on his boots," said Calhoun, not looking around, "I can't see it luring you down into the kitchens."
Sebastian went to sprawl in one of the straight-backed chairs beside the scrubbed kitchen table.
"I want to know what you can tell me about the residential brothels near Portman Square."
Calhoun glanced around, a lock of his straight flaxen hair falling across his high forehead.
"Were you looking for anything in particular, my lord?"
"I'm looking for a house where one could hire an attractive, gently bred woman of some 18 to 20 years of age. Dark hair, slim, educated."
Calhoun returned his concentration to the bubbling concoction on the stove.
"Such a mark of frailty has caught your fancy, my lord?" "Not exactly. Her name is Rose, or maybe Rachel Jones, and she was killed last night when someone attacked the Friends Magdalene house in Covent Garden. I have reason to believe she fled a house near Portman Square."
"Ah, I see. Well, there are only 3 stay-in brothels in the Portman Square area."
Calhoun poured a black mixture from a vial into his pot. Sebastian watched with interest. Like most valets, Calhoun kept his boot polish recipe a dark secret.
"If your girl was slim and well-bred," said the valet, "then I doubt she'd have been at the Golden Calf. They go for the buxom milkmaid type. There's a house in Challen Lane that sometimes has more refined girls, but they cater to those who like them young."
A quiver of distaste passed over his features.
"Very young. They're not all girls, either."
"And the third house?"
"I'd say it's probably your best bet. They call it the Orchard Street Academy. Most of the girls there are simply pretending to be ladies, but a few are the real thing. The abbess is a skinny, grasping harridan who was on the stage in her prime. Calls herself Miss Lill."
"She owns the place?"
"No, the actual owner is Ian Kane."
Calhoun reached for a small bottle.
"Now there's a crafty fellow."
Sebastian leaned forward.
"Tell me about him."
Calhoun added a small measure of what looked like neatsfoot oil.
"I've heard his father was a miner from Lincolnshire. Our Ian came up to London when he was but 17 and married a widow who owned a grog shop on Newgate. Now he owns at least a dozen different establishments, everything from grog shops to pubs to places like the Orchard Street Academy. He's smart, and he's ruthless."
"Ruthless enough to kill a woman who fled his house?"
Calhoun raised his spoon to test the consistency of his mixture.
"His wife died a year after the marriage, fell down the stairs and broke her neck. There are those who claim Kane pushed her, but then it could just be rumour."
Sebastian studied the valet's half-averted face.
"What do you think?"
Calhoun moved the pot of boot polish off the fire.
"I think people Ian Kane finds a danger, or even just a nuisance, seem to have a higher-than-average chance of ending up dead."
He glanced around, his blue eyes sombre.
"You do well to remember that, my lord."
Chapter 9. Hero Jarvis considered herself a sensible woman, not given to wilfulness or foolish stubbornness. She came from an ancient, powerful family and understood well the obligations such a heritage entailed. Nevertheless, she did not subscribe to the oft-expressed belief that a woman's virtues were limited to chastity, humility, and obedience. She did strive for humility, although it was at times difficult. She was also a chaste woman, and at the age of 25 had resigned herself to a virginal old age. But that state of affairs came more from an unwillingness to submit herself to a husband's power than from anything else.
And as for mindless obedience, well, in Hero's opinion, that was for children, servants, and dogs.
Her father tended to lump her in his mind with either the sentimentalists or the radicals. But in that he erred. She was neither. She considered fervent Democrats dangerously delusional, and while she supported charity work, she had no personal inclination to ladle porridge at a soup kitchen or volunteer in an orphanage. Her dedication to change and reform was more intellectual than emotional, and more legal than personal. She simply subscribed to a vastly different moral code from the one that governed her father, which did much to explain why he couldn't understand her. Her decision to take it upon herself not to allow the Magdalen House murders to be forgotten had not been reached lightly. But once she had resolved not to fail the woman who had died in her arms, Hero pursued her goal with the same single-minded drive that characterized her father. Because she knew herself deficient in the experience and skills necessary to deal adequately with the task at hand, it was a logical step to solicit the assistance of someone such as Viscount Devlin. But Hero knew it would be both disingenuous and cowardly for her to convince herself that her obligation ended there. And Hero Jarvis was neither disingenuous nor cowardly. Returning to the Jarvis townhouse on Berkeley Square, she exchanged her gown and matching pelisse of moss green for a more sombre grey walking dress of fine alpaca and a small veiled hat. Then, accompanied reluctantly by her maid, she set forth in her carriage for Covent Garden. Hero's research into the causes of the recent proliferation in the number of prostitutes in the metropolis had given her a familiarity with people and places unknown to most women of her station. She thought it made sense to use those contacts now in an attempt to find the woman who had originally arrived at the Magdalen house with Rose Jones. Lord Devlin might be skilled in the arts of detection, but the fact remained that he was a man, and Hero knew well the attitudes toward men that characterized the fallen women of the demi-rep. They would be far more likely to open up to Hero, a woman, than to a member of the sex they both hated and scorned. At this hour of the afternoon, the main square of Covent Garden was still given over to its market, the surrounding streets echoing with the shouts of fisher-wives and the hawkers' cries of "fresh hot tea" and "fine ripe oranges, sweet as sugar." The rouged and willing women who would emerge later to prowl the darkening colonnades and the theatres could still be found huddled in desultory conversation in the kitchens of their lodging-houses. Hero directed her coachman to a discreet lodging-house in King Street, run by an aged Irishwoman named Molly O'Keefe. A large woman with an ample girth and improbable red hair, Molly greeted her with hands on hips, a broad smile crinkling the flesh beside her watery grey eyes. Once, Molly had been a prostitute herself, but she had been shrewd enough to pull herself out of the downward spiral that ended for most in disease and an early death.
"I didn't expect to be seeing your ladyship again,"
said Molly, reaching out to pluck Hero off the small stoop.
Come in, come in."
"I'm not a ladyship, and you know it, Molly," said Hero, pressing into Molly's hands the basket of fine bread and fresh farm cheeses she had brought. "My father is a baron, not an earl." Molly laughed, showing tobacco-stained teeth.
"Sure, but you're a lady, no getting around that. Besides, you could be a ladyship if you wanted it. All you need to do is marry one of them lords I've no doubt are courting you."
"Now, why would I want to do that?" Molly laughed again.
"Damned if I know."
Trailed by her sour-faced maid, Hero followed the landlady down the shabby hall and into the kitchen, which served as the lodging-house's common room. The centre of the kitchen was taken up by an old and battered scrubbed table, around which grouped the house's various lodgers. Clothed in shabby dressing-gowns and slippers, a dozen or so women chattered with brutal frankness about men and clothes and their own wildly improbable schemes for the future. The close air smelled of beer and gin and onions, faintly underlain by another scent Hero had come to associate with such places, although its exact nature continued to elude her. Molly O'Keefe's lodging-house was not a brothel, although most of her lodgers were prostitutes. These were free-ranging prostitutes who preferred to keep their private lives separate from their trade. Scorning both the residential-style brothels and the lodging-house brothels, they lived here, in Molly O'Keefe's house, and took their pick-ups to an accommodation house to rent a room. Hero had never been to a residential brothel or a lodging-house brothel, or to an accommodation house. It frustrated her. But because she was a young unmarried gentlewoman, there were still certain boundaries she did not dare cross,
however impatient with convention she might be.
Her contact with the women of the street she studied had therefore been limited to neutral territory such as this, or refuges such as the Magdalen House. But she'd learned enough about them to understand the ties that bound one segment of the underworld to the next. Through the residents of Molly O'Keefe's house, Hero would have access to virtually every prostitute in London.
"I would like to address your boarders, if I may," she said to Molly,
and pushed back her veil.
Molly clapped her hands together. "Right then," she said loudly. "Listen up, you drunken lot of worthless tarts. The lady here wants to talk to you."
Someone snickered, while perhaps half of the women around the table continued to talk. A woman with short blonde hair and massive breasts visible at the gaping neck of her gown said,
"And why the hell should we listen to her?"
"Because what I have to say could earn you £20, said Hero, stepping to the head of the table. £20 were considerably more than a good housemaid could earn in a year. An immediate hush fell over the room. Now that she had their attention, Hero said, "Last Wednesday, 2 women fled a residential brothel near Portman Square. One called herself Rose. The other was named Hannah. Rose was one of the women killed at the Magdalen House last night, but Hannah left the refuge several days before the attack. She may be in danger, or she may know something about why the attack took place. I would like to speak to her." A murmur of whispers and desultory comments swelled around the room. Hero raised her voice and continued speaking. "If you or one of your acquaintances provides me with information that enables me to find Hannah, that person will receive a reward of £20.
"Why, you must be looking for me,"
said a tall, skeletally thin woman with long brown hair.
"I'm Hannah. How'd you know I was here?"
The other women around the table laughed, while Molly growled and said,
"Like hell, that's Jenna Kincaid."
"Please, do not think," said Hero, letting her gaze travel around the assembled women, "that I will be so foolish as to pay for false information. I will know the woman I seek when I find her. Anyone stepping forward will receive a reward only if the information she provides proves accurate."
"How do we know you don't mean this Hannah no harm?" shouted one of the women at the far end of the table.
"I am not here as an instrument of the law," said Hero again, having to raise her voice above an undercurrent of murmurs. "The women at the Magdalen House were murdered. The authorities have shown no interest in discovering who was responsible. No one knows why these women were killed, which means that Hannah may not be the only one who is in danger. Whoever killed those women could do it again. You are all potentially in danger." This statement provoked a predictable uproar. Hero waited a few moments, then said, "Anyone with the information I seek may meet me tomorrow morning at Bullock's Museum. I will be in the exhibition halls from 10 to 11 a.m. I will be wearing a navy blue walking dress and a hat with 2 ostrich plumes. But be warned, anyone wasting my time with false information will have reason to regret their perfidy." The women fell suddenly silent. Hero had a knack for sounding very much like her father when she wanted to. Molly's face was unusually grim as she walked with Hero to the lodging house's front entrance. "I've heard talk them women at the Magdalen House was murdered, but didn't credit it." "I'm afraid it's true," said Hero. She turned on the house's narrow stoop to take Molly's hand. "Thank you for your assistance." Molly's sagging cheeks took on a reddish hue. She jerked her head toward the kitchen. "You think them strumpets really is in danger?" "They could be. I honestly don't know." Molly studied her with narrowed, unblinking eyes. "Most of the fine gentlemen and women we see around here want to punish the whores, put them through a living hell so's they'll come out all pious and submissive. But you're not like that." Hero gave a soft laugh. "Perhaps because I don't like pious, submissive women." Molly didn't smile. She said, "Where's Hannah you're trying so hard to find? Did it ever occur to you that if she's in danger,
then you're putting yourself in danger too, by looking for her. I am far better protected than she. Maybe.
Molly nodded toward the waiting coach with its 2 liveried and powdered footmen.
But if you're smart, the next time you come down here you'll make certain that coachman of yours is carrying a blunderbuss. Nobody's completely safe.
Chapter 10. Treading cautiously over charred fallen timbers, blackened furniture, and shattered bricks, Sebastian worked his way through scorched rooms standing open to the joyless light of the cloudy afternoon. From the street came the rattle of a wagon and the cry of a scissors sharpener shouting, "Knives or scissors to grind today?" But here all was unnaturally silent, brooding. It had occurred to him that a visit to the Orchard Street Academy would be most productive in the hours after dark, and so he had returned here, to what had once been the Magdalen house, looking for answers to questions that hadn't yet occurred to him. Pushing his way through a ruined doorway, he surveyed what had once been the kitchen. If Rose Jones had been shot in the alley as Miss Jarvis had said, then her killers must have dragged her body in here before setting the house aflame. They might even have kindled the blaze from the kitchen hearth. A vague shuffling noise drew his gaze to the distant corner, where what he at first took for a dog rummaged for food. Only this was no dog. At the sound of Sebastian's footfalls, a child's head reared up, his face darkened with dirt and soot, his hair matted. With a gasp, the ragged youngster bolted for the open doorway, bare feet kicking up little tufts of ash as he ran. "Wait," called Sebastian, but the boy had already bolted off the back stoop and up the alley. Sebastian followed him into a narrow, shaded alleyway reeking of garbage and urine. To his left, the cobbled lane ended in a soaring brick wall. He turned right, retracing the steps Miss Jarvis must have taken the night before. The jumble of footprints in the muck could have belonged to anyone. But there, near the mouth of the alley, he found what he was looking for, a pool of dried blood smeared over the cobbles as if by a body being dragged. He crouched down, alert for anything out of place amidst the rotting cabbage leaves and offal. He found nothing. His head falling back, he stared up at the buildings around him. Surely someone had seen something, or heard something. Pushing to his feet, he started with the tea dealer who occupied the premises on the corner. The proprietor turned out to be a stout middle-aged widow with heavy jowls and an uncompromising grey stare, who flapped her apron and blustered at the first mention of the Magdalen house. "Good riddance, I say," she grumbled. "This is a respectable street, it is. We didn't need those tarts here. It's the judgment of God, if you ask me, what happened." "You didn't see anything suspicious? Before the fire, I mean. Some men watching the house, perhaps?" The tea dealer swung away to lift a massive crate and shift it to one side with as much effort as if it had been a small sewing basket. "There were always men hanging round that place. Stands to reason, don't it? I mean, considering what those women were." "Did you hear any gunshots last night?" She swung to regard him with hard, unfriendly grey eyes. She had a large mole on the side of her nose from which protruded 3 hairs. The hairs quivered as she looked him up and down suspiciously, taking in the glory of Calhoun's painstakingly polished boots, the flawless fit of Sebastian's coat, and the crisp white linen of his shirt and cravat. "What's it to you, anyway, a fine gentleman like yourself?" "I'm making inquiries for a friend. There are suggestions the fire wasn't accidental, that it was murder." "Suggestions?" The woman's meaty fists landed on her ample hips. "And who's making these suggestions, Them Quakers, I suppose. A lot of heathens, if you ask me, with their strange ways and outlandish ideas, impugning the integrity of God-fearing Christians." She leaned forward. "It was a fire. Houses burn in London all the time, especially the houses of the wicked."
God's judgment?
Exactly.
Leaving the musty, redolent atmosphere of the tea dealer, Sebastian ranged up and down the street, talking to a chandler's apprentice and a haberdasher, a coal merchant and a woolen draper. It wasn't until he stepped into the cheesemonger's shop directly opposite the burned-out house that he found someone willing to admit to having seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the evening before. The slim, brown-haired girl behind the simple wooden counter was young, no more than 14 or 15, with the rosy cheeks and clear eyes of a country lass.
What do you mean when you say, "Did I notice anything out of the ordinary before the fire last night?" she asked as she wrapped up the slice of blue cheese he had selected.
The dim light of the dreary day filtered in through aged windows that distorted the vision of a passing carriage. Standing here, Sebastian realized he had an unobstructed view of the blackened brick walls and broken chimneys across the street.
Someone who might have seemed out of place in the neighborhood, perhaps, he suggested.
She glanced up, an impish smile curving her lips.
"You mean that you?"
Sebastian laughed.
Am I so out of place?
"Well, we don't get the likes of you in here often, that's for sure."
She paused to lean forward, her elbows propped on the wooden counter, her smile fading as she dipped her voice.
"But yeah, I did see something struck me as kind of queer. I mentioned it to me dad, but he told me to mind me own business. Said we don't need no more trouble."
The earthy odour of aged cheddars and fresh farmers' cheeses rose up to scent the air around them. Sebastian found himself wondering what kind of trouble the cheesemonger and his family had already encountered, but all he said was,
"What did you see?"
She threw a quick glance at the curtained alcove behind her, as if to make certain her da wasn't lurking there.
"Man, gentleman. They was hanging around here for hours, wandering up and down the street, going in and out of shops, but not buying nothing."
"How many men?"
"I don't know exactly. 3, maybe 4. A couple of 'em came in here. They pretended like they was looking around, but mainly they was just keeping an eye on the house across the street."
"Were they dark-haired or fair?"
She thought about it for a moment.
"The 2 that come in here was dark. They was maybe a bit older than you, but not by much."
"Do you remember anything else about them?"
"Well—"
She dragged out the syllable, screwing up her face with the effort of recollection.
"They reminded me a bit of Mr. Nash."
"Mr. Nash?"
"The nabob what used to buy all his cheese from me da. He died last year."
"In what way did the gentleman remind you of Mr. Nash?"
She shrugged one shoulder. "I don't know. They just did."
Sebastian stared out the wavy-paned glass at what had been the Magdalene's house's entrance.
"Did you see those men go in the house?"
She shook her head. "It got so foggy, I couldn't have seen the king himself if he'd been driving down the middle of the street."
"What about after the fire started? Did you see the men then, in the crowd?"
Again she shook her head. Dropping her voice even lower, she said,
"But I did hear gunshots, 2 of 'em, right before the fire started."
So many people in the area had denied hearing any shots that Sebastian would have begun to doubt Miss Jarvis's tale if it hadn't been backed up by Gibson's medical observations.
He said, "No one else will admit to having heard a thing. Why would that be?"
Again that quick look over the shoulder.
"Nobody liked having that house here," she whispered. "They wanted it gone."
Sebastian studied the gentle lines of her young face, the baby fine light brown hair that fell in artless disarray from beneath her mob cap.
"So you're saying what?"
She drew in a quick gasp, her eyes widening as she realized how he might have interpreted what she'd just said.
"Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I think anyone around here had anything to do with what happened. I'm just saying people complained about the house so much. Maybe they're afraid someone might blame them if the constables start looking into how that fire came about."
Sebastian reached for his wrapped cheese and laid a generous payment on the counter.
"Then why did you tell me?"
"Pippa?"
A querulous voice came from the back of the shop.
"You still serving that customer?"
Pippa began to back away. "Why?" said Sebastian again. But the girl simply wheeled and disappeared through the curtained alcove. He stepped out of the cheesemonger's into a street filled with lengthening shadows and buffeted by a cold wind. As he turned toward his carriage, the familiar figure of a man separated itself from the gloom cast by a nearby coal wagon and moved to block Sebastian's path.
"I'm surprised to see you here, Devlin," said Colonel Bryce Epsom-Smith. "I was under the impression you'd given up this rather curious hobby of yours in favor of drinking yourself to death."
With deliberate slowness, Sebastian let his gaze travel over the former cavalry officer's tall, elegant person, from the smartly curled brim of his beaver hat to his shiny black hessians. When Jarvis had threatened Cat Boleyn with a traitor's death, Epsom-Smith had been his instrument. The man was smart, vicious, and lethal.
"Which curious hobby were you referring to?"
"Your self-appointed role as avenger of fair maidens brought too early to the grave." Epsom-Smith nodded toward the blackened walls of the burnt-out house across the street.
"Only these weren't exactly maidens now, were they? I take it you're here on Lord Jarvis's business."
Epsom-Smith hooked a thumb casually in the pocket of his silk waistcoat.
"I'd have said that in this instance, at least, we're about the same business." "Are we? I'm interested in seeing justice done. Your involvement suggests Lord Jarvis is intent on something else entirely." "Justice? For a half-dozen worthless whores? What are they to you?"
8, corrected Sebastian.
"There are 8 women dead, and if they're so worthless, why are you here?"
If the colonel knew the real source of Jarvis's interest, he was too adroit to betray it. All he said was,
"We could cooperate, you know."
"I don't think so." His smile never slipping, Epsom-Smith turned away. But he paused long enough to look back and say,
"If you should change your mind, you know where to find me."
Chapter 11. The night fell unseasonably cold, but clear, with a brisk wind off the distant North Sea that blew away the last of the lingering clouds and the coal smoke that could sometimes smother the city at this time of year. Leaving his town carriage at the corner of Portman Square, Sebastian walked the short distance up Orchard Street, his footsteps echoing on the stone cobbles. This was a mixed section of the city, close to the fine mansions of Mayfair, but with scattered older streets slowly fading with the passage of time. Laughter, blending with snatches of a melody, drifted from a nearby music hall, while the pungent aromas of freshly ground beans and blue ruin wafted from the coffee house and gin shop across the street. As he passed a doorway, a woman stirred from the shadows, a nearby oil lamp throwing wavering golden light across her bare blonde hair and thin face. "Looking for company?" she asked, her smile trembling. She couldn't have been more than 15, her eyes huge in a pale face. Sebastian shook his head and walked on. The Orchard Street Academy was an ancient mansion set slightly back from the street. Flickering lamplight showed him a freshly blackened door and curtains drawn tightly at all the windows. But one of the gutters hung rotten and broken, and a musty smell of decay filled the air. He rapped sharply on the door, then stood silent, while an unseen eye assessed his appearance. The guardians of such establishments were more skilled than any Bond Street beau at calculating in a glance the cost of a man's cape, buckskin breeches, and top boots. He was expecting to be admitted by some aging heavyweight from the fancy. Instead, the door was opened by a thin, middle-aged woman with a high-necked puce silk dress, brightly rouged cheeks, and dyed eyelashes.
"Good evening, kind sir,"
she said in the stentorian tones of a woman who is always on stage. "Do come in."
From a secluded alcove came the sound of a harp gently plucked by skilled fingers. He stepped into a parlour with fading green silk curtains and striped settees that might have graced the drawing-room of a countess down on her luck. Mildew bloomed in the once fine gilded mirror hanging over an empty hearth. The air smelled of wax candles and fine brandy, only faintly underlain by the musky tang of sex and rising damp.
While most prostitutes in London picked up their men off the streets or from such traditional stomping grounds as the theatre and Vauxhall before taking them back to rooms, the residential brothels still had their place. They appealed to women who shied away from the rough and dangerous competition on the streets, and they appealed to men, leery of venturing into back alleys or up the darkened stairs of an unknown house.
From the smoke-hazed room to Sebastian's right came the gentle murmur of voices and the whirl of cards. Glancing through the arched doorway, Sebastian recognized Sir Adam Broussard and Giles Axelrod among the half-dozen or so gentlemen seated around a baize-covered table. Yet the Flash Cove disappearing up the far stairs with a bottle of wine and a buxom golden-haired girl was obviously no gentleman. Despite its emphasis on pseudo-gentility, the Orchard Street Academy was not class-conscious when it came to its customers. Its only criterion was the ability to pay, and to pay well.
"You've not visited us before, have you?" said Miss Liddell,
her blue eyes assessing the gold fob on his watch chain, the silver head of his walking stick. Sebastian shook his head with a smile.
"No, your establishment was recommended to me by a friend."
Miss Liddell spread her hand in an expansive gesture that took in the three birds of paradise who had appeared to lounge casually around the parlour. They were dressed in gowns of jewel-toned silks, with plunging necklines from which spilled ripe breasts. The silk hugged every curve, leaving little to the imagination, while neat ankles peeked from beneath two short hems. It had been 8 months since Sebastian had known a woman's touch. Years since he'd thought of having any woman except for Kat. He wasn't thinking of it now. Something of his lack of interest must have shown on his face, because Miss Liddell said, "Perhaps you would like to order a bottle of wine to share with the ladies? Get to know them some before making your selection." The three Cyprians stared back at him with a bold assessment of women for whom a man is just another customer, a mark. One, a tall ebony-skinned woman with a regal neck, smiled at him and said in Jamaican accented English, "I'm Tasman." Beside her, a plump, heavily rouged impure, with the jet-black hair and pale skin of Ireland, pursed her lips and blew him a kiss. The third, a dainty gamin with a riot of short flaxen curls, wrinkled her childlike nose and laughed merrily. The impression was one of youthful innocence. But looking into her rainwater grey eyes, Sebastian suspected she was considerably closer to 25 than to 15. "A burgundy would be nice," said Sebastian. Miss Liddell nodded to the flaxen-headed Cyprian. "Becky will fetch it." "I'm interested in a woman my friend was telling me about," said Sebastian, going to settle on one of the striped silk cushions. "A tall, thin woman with light brown hair and green eyes." Becky, who had reappeared bearing a bottle of wine and glasses on a tarnished tray, faltered for one telling instant, her gaze flying to meet the Jamaican's startled stare. "Oh?" said Miss Liddell, calmly pouring the wine. "I think," he said, "her name was Rose," Sebastian continued, "although I could have that wrong." It had occurred to him that the woman might easily have made up a new name to give the Quakers at the Magdalen House. "My friend claims she is charming, with the manners and accents of a duchess." From upstairs came a thump, and a woman's startled scream quickly cut off. None of the women in the room even turned her head. "Your friend must have made the acquaintance of Rose Fletcher," said the abbess, handing him a glass of wine. Her fingers, when they brushed his hand, were unnaturally cold, as if the woman never saw the sun.
Unfortunately, Rose is not here this evening, but I think you'll find Becky an entertaining substitute."
Sebastian took a slow sip of the wine. It was surprisingly good.
"If I come back tomorrow, will Rose be here?"
Sebastian was aware of the dark-skinned woman Tasmin studying him with a fixed expression, but not a breath of emotion showed on the abbess's carefully made-up face. She stretched her lips into a smile.
"I'm afraid Rose has left us. You know how restless some girls are, never content to stay in one place. If Becky doesn't capture your fancy, then I'm sure you'll enjoy Tasmin."
Sebastian raised his wine to his lips again.
"Any idea where Rose might have gone?"
Miss Lill's smile stayed plastered across her face.
"I'm afraid not."
For one brief instant, the abbess's steely gaze flickered to the Jamaican. The girl rose gracefully to slip from the room.
"What a pity. I quite had my heart set on the girl."
Sebastian cast a searching glance around the parlour.
"My friend also asked me to give Mr. Kane his regards. Is he here?"
"Mr. Kane?"
"That's right, Mr. Ian Kane."
Miss Lill's pale blue eyes held his. The tension in the room had suddenly become palpable. She set aside her wineglass with a snap. She was no longer smiling.
"It seems none of our girls strikes your fancy. I think the time has come for you to leave."
Sebastian stretched to his feet. From somewhere overhead came the sound of a door slamming and a woman's drunken laughter.
"Thank you for joining me for a glass of wine," he said.
He dropped a coin on the table to pay for the bottle and inclined his head to the two remaining Cyprians.
"Ladies."
Outside, Sebastian paused at the top of the house's steps and let the cool breeze blow away the lingering, suffocating odours of the place. A couple of link boys darted past, lighting the way for a carriage drawn by a nicely matched team of greys, their torches filling the air with the scent of hot pitch. He had learned 3 things from his visit to the house: that Rose Jones had indeed practised her métier at the Orchard Street Academy, that she had once called herself Rose Fletcher, and that the circumstances surrounding her precipitous departure from the house were of such a nature that the very mention of her name was enough to throw the house's remaining inhabitants into a state of consternation. Idly swinging his walking stick, he descended the steps to the cobbled street. As he turned toward Portman Square, a large, burly man detached himself from the shadowy alley beside the house and walked right up to him.
"Why you nosing around here asking all them questions?"
the man demanded, his grizzled face shoved close enough that Sebastian breathed in raw gin fumes.
"And what's your business with Mr. Kane?"
The man had the look of an ex-prizefighter, with a broken nose and a cauliflower ear. In his late 30s or early 40s now, he was beginning to run to fat, but he was still a powerful mountain of a man, standing a good half a head taller than Sebastian, and with nearly half again his weight.
"I have a message for Mr. Kane, from an old friend," said Sebastian, tightening his grip on his walking stick.
The man's lips pulled back to reveal broken brown teeth.
"Mr. Kane don't associate with the clientele. What is it you really want? If you ain't here to sample the merchandise, you've no business here. It's my job to make sure there's no trouble in the house, and your kind's always trouble."
He reached out to crush Sebastian's lapel in one meaty fist.
"Don't you be coming back, you hear? We don't want your kind of business here."
"You are creasing my coat," said Sebastian.
"Yeah?"
The man's smile widened.
"Maybe I ought to crease your skull instead."
Moving calmly and deliberately, Sebastian swung his walking stick back and then up, driving the full force of his body behind it. The ebony stick sliced up between the bouncer's legs to whack against his testicles. The thug's eyes bugged out, his breath whooshing out of his body as he released his hold on Sebastian's coat, to bend over and cradle his genitals in both hands. Reaching down, Sebastian grabbed the man by the front of his greasy waistcoat and shoved him backward until his shoulder blades whacked up against the alley's brick wall.
Maybe you ought to consider answering a few questions."
Gritting his teeth, the bouncer groped his right hand toward a long blade sheathed in leather at his side. Sebastian whacked the man's wrist with a walking stick. The man howled and dropped the knife.
"That was not smart,"
said Sebastian, shoving the length of the walking stick against the man's throat, pinning him to the wall.
"It's also not a very nice way to treat a customer. I've a good mind to complain to Mr. Kane."
Sebastian tightened the pressure of the stick against the man's windpipe.
"Where can I find him?"
The man's mouth hung open, slack with fear.
"I can't tell you that."
Sebastian withdrew the walking stick from the man's throat and swung it down to whack him across the right knee. The bouncer went down in a crooked, crumpled heap.
"You might want to reconsider your reticence."
The man lay with one hand splayed over his knee, the other hand still cupped protectively around his genitals.
"I tell you, I don't know."
Sebastian lightly tapped the man's other knee with the stick's silver tip.
"That's not a very clever answer."
The bouncer licked his lips.
"He's at the Black Dragon, in Diet Street, near Mewks's Brewery."
"How will I know him?"
"He's a good-looking cove, copper-coloured hair. Spends most of his evenings in his office on the half landing, painting."
"Painting?"
"You know, pictures. He likes painting pictures of oars and of the river and the city."
"I'd like my visit to Mr. Kane to be a surprise," said Sebastian. "Let's make a deal, shall we? You don't tell him I'm coming, and I won't tell him you're the one who spilled the information that enabled me to find him. Do we understand each other?"
The bouncer wiped the back of one hand across his loose lips.
"You bloody bastard."
Sebastian thrust the tip of his walking stick beneath the man's chin, forcing him to tilt his head back at an awkward angle.
"Do we understand each other?"
"Aye, aye. Just get that bloody stick away from me, will ya?"
Sebastian dropped the tip of his walking stick to the knife lying on the wet cobbles, and with a flick of his wrist sent the blade clattering into the darkness of the alley.
"Pull steel on me again, and you're dead."
Chapter 12. Sebastian pushed his way through darkened streets crowded with ragged beggars and smocked workmen hurrying home to their suppers. The air was heavy with the scent of boiling cabbages and frying onions, and it occurred to him in passing that he hadn't eaten dinner himself. Appetite, like the desire for sleep, had eluded him for so long that he merely noted the passing of time without any accompanying urge to seek sustenance. He was vaguely surprised to find himself involved once again in an investigation of murder. He'd survived the past 8 months by tamping down all emotions, not just love and anger, but also curiosity and a desire for justice, even simple interest. He'd found lately that he could sometimes go as much as a day at a time without thinking about Kat, without remembering the scent that lingered on her pillow, without wanting her with an ache that left him ashamed and afraid. But there was a reason he'd deadened himself with alcohol and sleeplessness these past months. It was as if one emotion were linked to the other. Open up to one, and the others came flooding back out of control. He thought about the way he'd welcomed his encounter with the ex-pugilist of Orchard Street, and the realization troubled him. Violence could be seductive. He'd seen too many men lose themselves in the heady embrace of death and destruction during war. He knew what it could do to a man, what it had almost done to him once, what it could do again. He smelled the brewery now, the pungent scent of malt mixing with the ever-present odours of coal smoke and horse dung. Diet Street ran just to the northwest of Covent Garden, in that part of London known as St. Giles. A wizened black-clad woman with a fire in an old barrel was doing a good business selling roasted potatoes on a corner just opposite the Black Dragon. Sebastian paused to buy one as an excuse to linger for a moment, his gaze on the tavern across the street. It was a long, rambling place, built early in the last century with a second story that overhung the first. From the looks of things, its clientele was a mixture of local tradesmen and riffraff from the nearby rookeries. For a moment, he considered returning to Brook Street to change into a less conspicuous form of dress, then decided against it. He became aware of a hollow-cheeked girl of 8 or 10 standing in the shelter of a nearby doorway, her thin hands clutching a ragged shawl about her shoulders, her brown eyes fixed longingly on the potato in his hands. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. She hesitated a brief instant, then snatched the potato from him and took off, her heels kicking up the torn hem of her dress as she ran. Sebastian waited for an overloaded brewery wagon to rumble past, then crossed the street toward the Black Dragon. Halfway up the block he found a black-haired woman with a brazen smile and a low-necked, threadbare yellow dress, who would have retreated down the nearest alley with him, and done anything he asked of her for a few shillings. She gasped when he pressed a crown into her hand. "No," he said, when she would have led him into the beckoning darkness. "I've something else in mind." Her dark eyes peered up at him with uneasy suspicion. She was probably no more than 25, maybe 30. Once she had been pretty, and traces of her youth still lingered, but she'd obviously had a hard life. "What's your name?" he asked. She sniffed. "Cherry. Why?" "This is what I want you to do, Cherry. I want you to wait 2 minutes, then follow me into the Black Dragon. You'll see me standing in the back near the stairs. Ignore me. All you need do is create some sort of ruckus. If you're successful, there'll be another crown for you when I come out. Do you understand?" "A ruckus?" "That's right. Enough of a disturbance to attract and hold everyone's attention, but not so much as to land you in the roundhouse." "I can do that," said Cherry. "Good. Now remember, wait 2 minutes." Sebastian pushed open the tavern's door and walked into a murky, low-ceilinged common room that smelled of savoury pies and warm ale and warm men. A crescendo of talk and laughter rolled from the leaded windows overlooking the street to the narrow wooden-railed staircase at the back that led up to the first floor. Sebastian could see a closed door on the half-landing. Heads turned as he threaded his way between men in blue work shirts and rough corduroy coats. He found a place at the end of the bar, nearest the base of the stairs, and ordered a half-pint. Turning his back to the bar, he rested his elbows on the ancient boards and let his gaze wander over the scattered tables and darkened booths. Right on cue, Cherry walked into the room. A gust of wind from the open door shuddered the flames in the tin lamps, sending dancing light across her black hair and pale round shoulders. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze scanning the crowd as he had done. Her eyes flicked over him without a hint of recognition, then settled on a pot-bellied grey-whiskered man sprawled on his own at a table near the centre of the room. She planted her fists on her hips, her chin coming up in a display of fury that was utterly convincing. "There you are, you good-for-nothing mutton-monger." Her quavering, outraged tones cut across the murmur of male voices. The man with the grey whiskers paused in the act of raising his pint of ale to throw a quick glance behind him. "No point looking behind you, like you was expecting to find St. Peter himself standing there. I'm talking to you, you bloody belly-bumper." Grey Whiskers set down his ale with a thump and swallowed hard. "I don't know you." "Don't know me?" She descended on him, her arms akimbo, her black eyes flashing. "You don't know me, you say? I suppose you don't know your own 10 poor wee bairns then, either." Quivering with outrage, she stalked up to him. He was still pushing back his chair when she brought up her open hand and walloped him across the face. The smack of flesh against flesh brought a sudden hush to the assembly. A gangly, half-grown lad with a tray of empty tankards quickly set aside his burden to grab her arm. "Now, there ain't no call to—" She wiggled free of his restraint. "Let go of me, you bloody madge-cull." A bald-headed man with a broken nose reared up from a nearby table to collar the stripling with one beefy fist. "Hey, that's no way to treat a lady." Grey Whiskers surged to his feet, one hand clamped to his stinging red cheek. "Lady,
You calling her a lady?"
The man with the bald head swung around and planted one of his meaty fists in Grey Whisker's pot-belly. A cheer went up around the room. Someone threw a punch at the stripling, who ducked and fell back against a wooden chair, splintering it beneath him. Sebastian heard the door on the half-landing jerk open, and turned to see a burly man in a moleskin waistcoat come barrelling down the stairs into the melee.
Here, what's this? We'll have none of that at the Black Dragon."
Sebastian quietly slipped past him up the stairs and into the chamber on the half-landing. After the dim haze of the common room, the chamber's blaze of lights made Sebastian's eyes water. 2 branches of wax candles burned on the mantelpiece, with 3 more scattered on the tabletops around the room. Ian Kane stood before an easel in the centre of a good Chinese rug. Of medium height and build, with hair the colour of burnished copper, he was stripped down to his breeches, shirt and waistcoat, and held a piece of charcoal in his hand. Some 10 feet in front of him, a winsome young thing with soft white flesh and a halo of golden curls sprawled on a blue velvet divan. She wore pink slippers and a pearl necklace, and nothing else. At Sebastian's entrance, Kane glanced around. The girl jerked, but Kane said, "Don't move," and she froze. "Nicely done," said Sebastian, coming to look at a half-completed charcoal sketch, somewhat in the style of Ingress. From the room below came the sound of breaking glass and a man's hoarse shout. Kane reached for a rag and calmly wiped his fingers. "I presume you started that for a reason." The faint echo of a Lancashire burr was still there in the brothel owner's speech, but he'd obviously made considerable efforts to eradicate it in the 10 or 15 years that had passed since he'd fled the mines. His breeches, coat and waistcoat could only have come from the best Bond Street tailors. Sebastian could easily see Pippa from the cheesemonger's shop taking this man for a gentleman. However nefarious the nature of his current businesses, Kane was working hard at obscuring his origins. But unless he dyed his hair, Pippa was unlikely to have described him as dark. "I thought our conversation would be more congenial without the presence of one of your gentlemen of the fancy," said Sebastian. He wandered the room, his gaze roving over the series of canvases on the wall. Done in oils, in much the same style as the charcoal sketch on the easel, the paintings included both London street scenes and views of ships on the Thames. One particularly striking image of the Church of All Hallows, Barking, caught in a stream of sunlight, was only half finished, but most of the paintings were of naked women, in a variety of languid poses. "I suppose that's one of the advantages of running a brothel," said Sebastian. "There can't be many artists with such ready access to a house full of women who are more than willing to take off their clothes." Kane merely set aside his rag and grunted. "I wonder," said Sebastian, "did you ever paint Rose Fletcher?" "Who?" "Rose Fletcher. Up until last week she was one of the dashers at the Orchard Street Academy. I understand you're the proprietor?" Kane picked up a short piece of charcoal and traced a neat line along the hip of the figure in his sketch. "I have more than one house and employ scores of women. Do you think I know them all?" From below stairs came a loud thump, followed by a bellow of rage. Sebastian said, "This woman left your house precipitously and went into hiding. I'm wondering if she was hiding from you." "What do you think?" said Kane, keeping his attention on his work, "that I stock my houses with traffic from some nefarious white slave ring?" He had a slickly handsome face, and a wide mouth full of straight white teeth he showed in a smile. "Why would she hide from me? Every soiled dove on the street would have you think she was kidnapped and forced into the trade. It's all a fantasy. The girls in my houses are there because they choose to be, and they're free to leave whenever they want." Sebastian glanced toward the Cyprian on the divan. She made a small movement, then lay still, her rosy-tipped breasts rising gently with each breath. A faint flush of colour had spread across her cheeks. It was one thing, evidently, to pose naked for Ian Kane, but something else to do it in the presence of a stranger. Sebastian said,
"You weren't angry that she left?"
A muscle jumped along Kane's suddenly tight jaw.
"Whores leave all the time. They usually come back. But even if they don't, do you think I care? There are always more where they came from."
He jerked his head toward the street below.
"You can't walk a block without tripping over half a dozen strumpets."
Perhaps. Yet Rose Fletcher was undoubtedly afraid of someone.
"Most whores are afraid of someone. A husband, maybe, or a boyfriend who's a little too handy with his fists."
Kane cocked his head to one side, studying the sketch before him.
"What I'm wondering," he said,
carefully smudging the line he'd just drawn,
"is why a fine gentleman like yourself would take an interest in a piece of Haymarket wear. Surely you don't fancy her for yourself?"
"Not exactly. She's dead. She was one of the 8 women murdered at the Magdalen house last night." The suggestion that the fire at the Magdalen house was no accident didn't seem to surprise Kane. But then word travelled fast on the streets. Without looking up, he said,
"You think I did that?"
"I think you're hiding something." There was a pause, after which the brothel owner appeared to come to a decision. He reached for a finer piece of charcoal.
"You're right. Rose Fletcher was at the academy. She was there the better part of a year. I don't know why she left. She never gave any indication she was unhappy there."
"Rose Fletcher wasn't her real name, was it?"
"Probably not. They all take nom de guerre."
"Do you know where she came from?" Kane gave a sharp bark of laughter.
"Women like her are a commodity. You think I care where they come from? We're not talking fine wine here. The provenance is immaterial."
Sebastian glanced toward the naked woman on the divan. The flush in her cheeks had deepened. "Did Rose ever have trouble with anyone at the academy?"
"You mean customers?"
Kane shook his head.
"We're very careful with our clientele. Those who like it rough learn to go someplace else."
"Did she have any special customers?"
"She was a popular piece of merchandise."
His eyes narrowed as he layered in defining details to his sketch of the woman's breasts.
"But as a matter of fact, there was one particular customer that I know of. He was so enamoured of her that he offered to buy her away from the house."
"Buy her? I thought you said these women aren't slaves." Kane shrugged.
"She had some debts. Most whores do. They work to pay off what they owe."
It was the usual practice. Advance the women just enough money to keep them in a perpetual state of debt so that they couldn't leave even if they wanted to. It wasn't technically slavery, but that's what it amounted to. Sebastian studied the man's smooth face. He had a faint blue line, like a tattoo, that ran across his forehead. Sebastian had seen marks like that before, on miners. Coal dust settled into healing cuts, leaving a mark that never disappeared. Kane had obviously spent some time in the mines himself as a lad before fleeing to London. Sebastian said, "What was the name of the customer who tried to buy her?"
"O'Brien. Luke O'Brien."
"Who is he?"
Kane flashed his white smile. "You think I'm going to give you everything?"
"Actually, I'm wondering why you've told me as much as you have." Kane laughed, his attention all for his sketch. Sebastian said, "And was Rose willing to be released to this O'Brien?" Kane kept his gaze on his sketch.
"Actually, no."
"Why not?"
"She didn't say."
"She didn't say, or you're not saying?" They were both aware of a heavy tread on the stairs. A moment later, Kane's pet prizefighter came back into the chamber, the thug's eyes narrowing when he saw Sebastian.
"Trouble here, Mr. Kane?"
"No trouble," said Sebastian, one hand slipping significantly to the small flintlock he kept in his coat pocket. "I was just leaving." The henchman's gaze flicked to Sebastian's hand. He set his jaw, but stayed where he was. Sebastian smiled.
"Good evening, gentlemen."
He bowed to the silent woman on the divan.
"Madam."
Cherry was waiting for Sebastian on the footpath outside the Black Dragon.
"You didn't get hurt, did you?"
he said, dropping a crown into her outstretched palm.
Me? Nah, it was a bit of fun. Did your little trick get you what you wanted?
Sebastian glanced toward the tavern in time to see a bulky shadow jerk back away from the lamplight.
"I'm not sure."
Chapter 13. George, Prince Regent of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, gripped a vial of smelling salts in one plump white hand and held it to his own nostrils.
"Percival tells us there was another attack in Yorkshire," said the prince. "Luddites."
He inhaled deeply and shuddered, although whether it was in reaction to the smelling salts or the thought of the Luddites, Jarvis couldn't be certain.
"Carrying on like savages," continued the prince. "Hiding their faces, smashing machines. Something must be done about this." "A number of arrests have already been made," said Jarvis, privately consigning the Prime Minister to the devil. Whatever had possessed Percival to regale the regent with this tale? "Unfortunately, the lower orders are still infected by the events in France. They think they can remold society, become uppity with their betters. But the more progress our armies make on the continent, the sooner these Luddites and their ilk will see the error of their ways." "Yes, but are we making progress on the continent?"
"We will," said Jarvis resolutely. The regent shifted against his pillows, restless. A giant platter of buttered crab and 4 bottles of port after dinner last night had brought on the most alarming of the prince's symptoms: the bowel distress, the tingling in his hands and feet, the mental confusion. That episode, combined with a heavy bleeding by Dr. Heberden, had left George too exhausted to do more than totter between his bed and his dressing-room couch, but not, unfortunately, too exhausted to receive his Prime Minister. George said,
"Percival brought me a copy of his newest pamphlet. He seems to have discovered an alarming prophecy in the Bible. Something about a new satanic power rising in the West. The pamphlet is there, near the window."
The prince waved one fat, beringed hand in a vague gesture toward a small table. Jarvis generally tried to ignore the Prime Minister's periodic attempts at elucidating godly intent. Religion had its place in society, reconciling the masses to their fate and assuring their docile acceptance of the rule of their betters. But this was taking things too far. "Don't tell me Percival has equated our former American colonies with this new satanic threat?" The regent took another sniff of his salts.
"He fears it may be so."
"Well, I'll be certain to read this new pamphlet with interest," said Jarvis. Tucking the offending publication beneath one arm, he bowed himself out of the royal presence. A tall, muscular man had been leaning against the far wall of the prince's antechamber. As Jarvis crossed the room toward the corridor, the man fell into step beside him.
"About the matter we discussed earlier,"
said Colonel Epsom Smith.
"Walk with me,"
said Jarvis, turning into the corridor. The 2 men's footsteps echoed up and down the cavernous space. Epsom Smith kept his voice low.
"It seems someone else has an interest in the event."
"Oh," said Jarvis, without breaking stride.
"Devlin." "Devlin? What is his interest in this?"
"He refuses to say. There's a woman making inquiries as well."
"A woman?"
Jarvis swung to face the man beside him, and whatever Epsom Smith saw in Jarvis's face caused the colonel to take a step back.
"I'm not certain yet who she is, my lord." But word on the streets is that a gentlewoman has been asking questions at some of the lodging-houses in Covent Garden and—"
"Forget about that woman," Jarvis snapped, and continued walking. Epsom Smith inclined his head and fell into step beside him.
"As you wish, my lord. And, Devlin?"
Jarvis paused at the entrance to his own chambers. A thin, nervous clerk leapt to attention. "My lord!" Jarvis thrust the Prime Minister's pamphlet at the clerk and said curtly,
"Burn this."
The clerk bobbed a frightened bow. "Yes, my lord." To Epsom Smith, Jarvis said simply,
"I'll deal with Devlin."
Chapter 14. Paul Gibson kept his surgery in an ancient sandstone building at the base of Tower Hill. Beside it stood his house, also of stone, but small and ill-kept. For Gibson was a bachelor, with a housekeeper named Mrs. Federico, who refused to set foot in any room containing human parts in glass jars, a prejudice that effectively limited her to the kitchen, dining room, and hallway. "It's a pig's fetus," said Gibson, identifying the small purplish-pink curl floating in liquid in a jar on the parlour mantelpiece that had caught Sebastian's attention. "I was using it for comparative purposes in my anatomy class at St. Thomas's." "Ah," said Sebastian, going to splash brandy into 2 glasses and carrying one to his friend.
"I told Mrs. Federico it was a pig,"
said Gibson, taking the glass with thanks.
"But she still refused to clean in here."
Sebastian moved a pile of papers and books from the worn leather sofa to the floor and sat down.
"One would think she'd be used to it by now."
"Some people never get used to it."
Sebastian wasn't sure he himself would ever get used to the body parts Gibson scattered so carelessly around his house, but he kept that observation to himself. Gibson said, "Sir William turned all of the women's bodies over to the Friends for burial. The service is set for tomorrow evening. Unfortunately, the Friends refused to grant me permission to perform any post-mortems, but they did allow me to examine the bodies more thoroughly."
"And?"
"I don't think any of those women died from the fire." Gibson propped the stump of his left leg up on a stool, his head bowed to hide the grimace of pain that contorted his features. There were times, Sebastian knew, when the pain grew so fierce that Gibson could abandon himself for days to the sweet relief of opium-induced oblivion. They were all dead, or close to it, when the fire was set. "At least," the doctor added, "I assume it was set. I have no evidence of that." Sebastian raised his brandy to his nostrils and inhaled its heady scent. "It's difficult to be certain," Gibson continued, "but I wouldn't say the killings were an act of passion. Whoever did it was very methodical. They must have killed each woman in turn, then simply moved on to the next. There was no superfluous hacking of the bodies." Sebastian nodded silently. In the war, they'd both seen men caught in the grip of a killing frenzy hack at bodies over and over again, long after life had expired. "What can you tell me about the woman who was shot?" "Not a great deal, I'm afraid. The body was badly burned. From her teeth, I'd say she was less than 20. She was a slim, fairly tall woman. Does that sound like your Rose Jones?" "When she was at the academy, she called herself Rose Fletcher." Gibson raised one eyebrow. "You think that's her real name?" "Probably not. Joshua Walden thinks her name might once have been Rachel." Gibson grunted. "Not your standard Molly or Elizabeth." "No. Whoever she was well-bred. Everything I've found so far suggests that her presence at the Magdalen house was the reason for the slaughter." Sebastian became aware of Gibson's eyes upon him, studying him intently.
"Why have you involved yourself in this?"
Gibson asked. Sebastian took a slow sip of his drink. "Have you noticed anyone else interested in solving these murders?" "Women are murdered on the streets of London all the time, Sebastian." "Not like this." Gibson was silent for another moment. Then he said, "It's because of Jarvis, isn't it? It's a way of sticking your finger in his eye." A slow smile curved Sebastian's lips. "That's part of it, yes." "Does Miss Jarvis know that your motives aren't entirely chivalrous?"
"Oh, she knows all right. In fact, she's counting on it."
Gibson shifted his weight, seeking a more comfortable position for his mangled leg.
"I saw Miss Boleyn today when I was in Covent Garden. She stopped her carriage and spoke to me."
Sebastian took a long, slow swallow of his drink and said nothing.
"She asked about you," said Gibson. "She wanted to know how you were doing." "What did you say?"
"I lied. I told her you're fine."
Sebastian took another drink.
"She isn't Miss Boleyn any more."
"She still uses it as a stage name, does she not?"
She did, of course, but Sebastian was careful never to let himself think of her in that way.
"I told her you'd involved yourself in another murder," said Gibson.
She wouldn't like that, Sebastian thought. In the past, she'd always fretted about what his involvement in the pursuit of murderers cost him.
Then again, perhaps she no longer cared.
Or cared in a different way, as a sister, rather than as the lover she'd once been.
To Sebastian's relief, Gibson changed the subject again. He said, "You think the brothel owner, this Kane, could be behind the killings?"
Sebastian blew out a long breath. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding it.
"I think he's more than capable of it. The problem is, I'm not sure why he would do it."
"Rose Fletcher ran away from him, didn't she? She sounds as if she was a valuable commodity." "Valuable, yes, but not exactly rare. This town is full of women ready to sell themselves to stay alive. And while Kane might have kept her in debt, you can be sure he'd never let the debt become excessively large." "She could have been killed as an example to others," said Gibson.
"She could have been," Sebastian agreed.
"But to kill 7 women just to get to 1?
He shook his head.
"No. I think whoever did this was desperate." "Or very angry," said Gibson. "How do you intend to find this man O'Brien?"
Sebastian drained his brandy.
"I'll set Tom on it tomorrow."
Gibson lurched to his feet and reached for his friend's empty glass.
"A girl like that, educated, well-born. How could she have come to such an end?"
"Someone betrayed her," said Sebastian, "and I'm not talking about whoever killed her. She was betrayed before that by those whose duty it was to love her and care for her. I wonder if her family even know she's dead." Sebastian raised his gaze to the pig fetus on the mantelpiece. "I'd say that depends on whether or not they're the ones who killed her." Chapter 15. Wednesday, 6th of May, 1812. Sebastian stood beside his bedroom window, his gaze on the still sleeping city streets below, on the gleam of dew on the cobbles, and the pigeons fluttering on the ridge of a nearby roofline. In the pale blush of early dawn, the chimneys of London loomed thick and dark, the spires of the city's churches thrusting up against a slowly lightening sky. It was that hour between night and day, when time seemed suspended, and a man could get lost in the past, if he let himself. Grasping the sash, he thrust up the window and let the frigid air of the dying night bite his naked flesh. He'd been driven here from his bed by the dreams that still crept upon him far too often in the undefended hours of sleep. During the day, he could control his thoughts, even control the yearnings that still came upon him. But sleep made him vulnerable, which is why he avoided it as much as possible. Some men could spend a lifetime in a soft brandy-tinged blur, squinting through a smoky haze at cards that meant nothing. Win or lose, the deadness inside remained. But it was all an illusion, Sebastian had decided, both the sensation of inner deadness and the comfort of the blur. A trick a man played on himself. No one else was fooled. The day broke warm and sunny, with all the golden promise of the long-delayed spring. Sebastian breakfasted early, then called his tiger, Tom, into the library. Tom came in, dragging his feet.
"I didn't mean to do it,"
he blurted out. Sebastian looked up from the estate agent's report he'd been reading and frowned. "You didn't mean to do what?" Tom hung his head, his tiger's cap twisted between his hands.
"I'm that sorry, Governor. Truly I am."
"If you set fire to the tails of Murray's coat again—"
Tom's head jerked up.
"I didn't."
Thank God for that, at least.
For all his disapproving ways, Murray ran Sebastian's decidedly irregular household with the competence and efficiency of the gunnery sergeant he'd once been. Sebastian would be hard put to replace him.
"Out with it, then,"
he said, his gaze steady on the tiger.
"What have you been doing?"
"I was down in the kitchen, see? Me and Adam, he's the new footman. We were just playing around and—"
Sebastian became aware of a disturbance emanating from the lower regions of the house. Madame Leclerc's outraged cries punctuated by Calhoun's soothing tones.
"Explain it to me later. I want you to find someone for me. A man named Luke O'Brien."
Tom's eyes flashed with anticipation.
"You think he might have something to do with the murder of them women?"
"I think he might."
"What manner of man is he?"
"I haven't the slightest idea. The only thing I know about him is that he frequents a brothel near Portman Square called the Orchard Street Academy."
Tom jammed his cap back on his head.
"I'll find him, near you fear."
"Oh, and Tom—"
Tom turned at the door.
"Be careful."
Tom flashed a gap-toothed grin and took off. The noise level from the kitchen increased. Sebastian set aside his estate agent's report and stood up. He was crossing toward the entry hall when he became aware of the sounds of a carriage drawing up outside his door. Glancing out the library's bowed front window, he saw a smartly dressed young woman appear in the carriage's open door. She was tall and striking, with glossy dark hair and a wide, laughing mouth. She stood for a moment, the sunlight soft on her face, and just the sight of her was enough to make his breath catch. He watched as she extended one hand elegantly gloved in yellow kid, and accepted her footman's assistance down the carriage steps. Memories of last night's dreams came to him in a wash of shame. Memories and desires that had driven him from his bed last night, and that haunted him still. For 8 months now she'd called herself Mrs. Russell Yates. But once her name had been Cat Boleyn, and she'd been the love of Sebastian's life. Now he called her sister. Chapter 16. Sebastian waited with his back to the empty hearth and let Murray usher his visitor into the library. She came in smelling of the cold morning air and herself, and the assault on his self-control was so great that he could only stand there with his hands gripped together behind his back and watch her. She paused just inside the door, her head turning as Murray bowed himself out. For a long moment her gaze met Sebastian's across the room. She said, "I didn't expect you to be glad to see me." His voice was a rusty, grating sound.
"You shouldn't have come."
She searched his face, her blue, sincere eyes narrowed with worry and her own pain. "You know I wouldn't be here without good reason."
"Something's wrong. What is it?"
He watched her jerk off her fine kid gloves and loosen the velvet strings of her hat. Once she had been the center of his existence, the only woman he'd ever wanted to take to wife. Then 8 months ago, his life had come tumbling down around him in a series of brutal revelations. The discovery that his father, the Earl of Hendon, once kept a beautiful Irish actress named Arabella as his mistress, had come as no surprise. Many men of their station did so. Nor was it unusual that Hendon had fathered a child upon his mistress. Such matters were typically handled discreetly. After birth, the child would be taken from its mother and dispatched to some good farm family in the country, never to be seen or heard from again. Except in this instance, the mother of Hendon's love child had balked at his determination to separate her from her baby and fled back to Ireland. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, Arabella's child had, in her turn, come to London. Calling herself Cat Boleyn, she had become one of the most acclaimed actresses of the London stage and mistress to a young viscount, Hendon's son, Sebastian. She stood before him now, her fine kid gloves held in a tight grip, her carefully schooled face inscrutable. She said, "Do you know Hendon is not well?" Sebastian shook his head.
"He has said nothing to me."
"Well, he wouldn't, would he? You don't speak to him."
"You make it sound as if I cut him. I don't."
"Of course not. That would be too vulgar, wouldn't it? Odd that a curt hello in passing should wound more than the cut direct. That at least would betray some emotion."
"Has he sent you here to plead his case?"
"You should know better than that." She was right, of course. He did know better.
"I beg your pardon."
He swung away to the collection of carafes and glasses that rested on a table near the window.
"A glass of ratafia."
He glanced over to see a wry smile curve her lips. "I think we both need something stronger, don't you?" He reached for the brandy.
"Something stronger, definitely."
The tension in the room, the awareness of what had once been between them and could never be again, stretched taut. She said, "Hendon is not to blame for what happened. He did nothing that men of his station haven't done for 1,000 years or more. He took a mistress and begat a child upon her. How could he have foreseen what we would become to each other?" Sebastian glanced up from splashing brandy into 2 glasses.
"You defend him? He would have taken you from your mother if she hadn't fled him."
"He meant it for the best."
"For whom?"
She didn't answer him. Hendon always did what was best for the sincere lineage and the sincere legacy. Anything and anyone else was expendable. She said, "You're not angry with Hendon because of what he would have done to my mother?"
"I've been angry with Hendon for years. This is just one more lie on top of so many others."
"Not a lie exactly, Sebastian. He didn't know I was his child. None of us did."
"Yet he knew you existed, and he never said a word. It rather begs the question, doesn't it? What else hasn't he told me?"
Sebastian held out her glass. She took it, being very careful not to allow her fingertips to brush his. She said, "You haven't found your mother yet?" For half his life, Sebastian had believed his mother dead, the victim of a boating accident the summer he was 11. In truth, she had merely fled her loveless marriage and abandoned Sebastian, her only surviving son. Another lie his father had told him. He said, "I believe she's in France somewhere. The war makes searching for her awkward." He took a slow sip of his brandy and felt it burn all the way down.
"You have forgiven Hendon for what he did to your mother?"
"I was angry with him at first, yet I've come to believe his love for Arabella was genuine. I see it in his face when he speaks of her. His voice softens, his eyes come alive." Some flicker of emotion must have shown on Sebastian's own face, because she said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." And he knew she'd misunderstood entirely the pain and envy she'd glimpsed.
"I've known most of my life that there was no love in my parents' marriage," he said.
She went to stand beside the bowed window overlooking Brook Street, her head turned away, and for one stolen moment he lost himself in looking at her.
"Do you see Hendon much?" he asked.
She swung to face him again. "He comes to the theatre. Sometimes we go for a drive in the park."
"I don't imagine Amanda likes that," said Sebastian.
Amanda, Lady Wilcox, was Sebastian's other sister, his legitimate sister. "She knows the truth," said Kat.
"And acknowledges you no more than he."
"How can either of them acknowledge the truth when all the world knows I was your mistress?" Painful words, words that brought back the shame of all they had once done together. Yet, with the shame, came such a rush of every feeling Sebastian had spent the last 8 months trying to ignore that he shuddered. She set aside her brandy, untouched. "I can understand your anger. You think I'm not angry? But to blame Hendon for it is not right. He didn't do this to us." He drained his own glass and set it down with a snap.
"Yet he somehow managed to get what he wanted, didn't he?"
Sebastian had loved Kat since he was 21 and she just 16. For all those years, Hendon had fought and schemed to prevent his son and heir from marrying beneath him. In a sense, it was ironic that the key to the destruction of their love had been there all along, if only he'd known.
"You think the fact that it is—"
Sebastian realized what he'd been about to say and began again. "You think the fact that it was wrong for me to want you should somehow make the loss of you easier to bear? Well, it doesn't." He was surprised to see a sad smile light up her eyes. "Oh, Sebastian, you always think you should be able to change things to make them right."
"Are you telling me I'm arrogant?"
"You know you are." They shared a smile that faded slowly. He said, "How are you, truthfully?" "Truthfully?" She raised her chin in a gesture he remembered all too well. "Yates is not a demanding husband. We deal well together. He has his life, and I have mine." Sebastian had heard something of Russell Yates's activities, the unorthodox but discreet liaisons that had continued since his marriage. He'd heard no such tales of Kat. "Do you?" he said. She twitched one shoulder in a shrug. "I have my work at the theatre. It's enough." He walked up to her, close enough that he could have touched her, although he did not. "More than I want anything else," he said. "I want you to be happy." She gazed up at him. "True happiness is rare."
"It shouldn't be."
"Paul Gibson tells me you've involved yourself in the death of these women in Covent Garden."
"Yes."
He was aware of her searching his face, and he wondered what she saw there. The sleepless nights, the months of drinking and dissipation that had brought oblivion, if no relief. She said, "In the past, I always worried whenever you found yourself drawn into murder investigations. But I suppose it's preferable to watching you break your neck on a hunting field or drink yourself to death." He swung abruptly away.
"You say Hendon is not well. What's wrong with him?"
"The doctors say it's his heart. He eats too much, drinks too much."
"That's not likely to stop."
"He's been worse these last months. He misses you, Sebastian. The estrangement between you causes him much grief." Sebastian paused before his desk and looked back at her. It was a moment before he could answer.
"I'm sorry. I'm not ready to speak to him yet."
She nodded briskly, then retied her bonnet strings and pulled on her fine kid gloves. "Just don't wait until it's too late, Sebastian." Chapter 17. At the highly unfashionable hour of 9:30 in the morning, Miss Hero Jarvis was drinking a cup of tea in the morning room when her father came upon her. "You're up early," she said. He sank into the chair opposite hers.
"I wanted to catch you before you left the house."
"Oh? Would you like a cup of tea?" she asked, reaching for the teapot.
"Yes, thank you."
He leaned forward, his frowning gaze hard on her face.
I thought we had an agreement.
She poured a measure of milk into his cup with a steady hand, then added the tea. I haven't violated it. I agreed not to approach the magistrates, and I have not done so. Of course, their agreement had been more along the lines of an edict, to which he'd had little choice but to concur. He'd warned her that if she did attempt to approach the magistrates about the killings, he would let it be known that her claims to have been present in the house at the time of the attack were motivated by nothing more than a desire to draw attention to the plight of such women, and should therefore be disregarded. She handed him the cup. I take it you've received a report from one or more of your minions?
You knew I would.
Yes. He pressed his lips together in a sour line.
It is you, isn't it? The gentlewoman who has been asking questions about the Magdalen house.
Did you think I would not? When he didn't answer, she said, I know your main concern in all this is that my name not be bandied about in connection with the incident. You needn't fear that I've been anything other than discreet. There is nothing to link my name to what happened that night. Lord Jarvis pushed aside his tea, untasted, his gaze still on her face.
If I ordered you to stop, would you obey me?
She met his stare without flinching. Yes, but I would resent it. Jarvis nodded.
Then I won't ask it of you.
Hero didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until she felt it easing out of her in a long sigh. He pushed to his feet.
It goes without saying that you will be cautious.
I will be cautious. He nodded again and left the room. She stared after him in surprise. She had expected him to ask her about Devlin's involvement as well, for she had no doubt that by now her father had also learned of the Viscount's interest in the murders. Jarvis's reticence puzzled her, but only for a moment. She did not know all the details of the animosity between the two men, but she knew it ran deep. And she realized it doubtless had never occurred to Lord Jarvis that Devlin had involved himself in the Magdalen House murders at her specific request. At just before 10 o'clock that morning, Hero's carriage drew up before the pylon-shaped facade of Bullock's Museum at 22 Piccadilly. Giant 12-foot statues of Isis and Osiris, nearly naked and bewigged à l'Egyptien, stared down at her. She paid her shilling fee and passed through a papyrus-columned portico styled to resemble the entrance to an Egyptian temple. For an extra sixpence, she was able to acquire a small booklet detailing the wonders of the various exhibition halls. She wandered for a time, studying first the collection of carvings in wood and ivory, then the curiosities brought back from the South Seas by Captain Cook. In the western wing, she came upon the Pantherian, which contained, according to her booklet, all the known quadrupeds of the earth, stuffed, of course. The Pantherian was reached by way of a basaltic cavern said to be modelled on the Giant's Causeway of the Isle of Staffa, although her guidebook neglected to mention precisely where that might be. In the distance, Hero could hear a progression of church bells chiming the quarter hour. It was nearly 11 o'clock. She studied an Indian hut set against the background of a tropical forest, complete with glassy-eyed elephants and roaring tigers, and a large coiled snake, and felt a sense of frustration well within her. It had been a mistake, she realized, to set the rendezvous for this morning. She'd been driven by a sense of urgency, but she should have allowed more time for news of her reward to spread, more time for the women of Covent Garden to summon up the courage to step forward. She climbed the steps to the first floor, where a room, styled to resemble a medieval hall, displayed an exhibit of historic arms and armour. Here she found a young woman seated by herself on a bench beneath the domed ceiling. Hero eyed the woman with a renewed surge of expectation. She was obviously waiting for someone. She sat with her reticule clutched in both hands, her gaze darting warily around the room. With her demure pink muslin and round bonnet, she looked more like a young debutante than Haymarket wear. but perhaps she had deliberately dressed in a way that would not draw attention to herself. Hero had just made up her mind to approach the young woman when she jumped up from her seat and rushed across the hall toward the stairs. Looking around, Hero noticed the gentleman in buff-coloured breeches and an olive-drab coat who had followed her up the steps. Of course, thought Hero, a secret assignation. Blowing out an ungenteel breath of disappointment, Hero was about to turn back toward the stairs herself when a woman's lightly accented voice said, "You're the one, aren't you? The gentry mort who was at Molly O'Keefe's asking questions about Rose and Hannah." Hero turned as a tall Jamaican with a long regal neck and an elegant carriage stepped out of the shadows. Hero felt a frisson of anticipation. "Do you have information for me?" "For a price," said the Jamaican. "You'll be paid your £20 when and if the information you provide proves to be correct." The woman's almond-shaped eyes narrowed. "How do I know you'll deliver?" Hero's head jerked up. No one had ever before questioned her honour. "You have my word." The woman simply laughed. Hero said, "What's your name?" "Tasmin. Tasmin Poole." "You know where I can find Hannah?" Tasmin Poole shook her head. "I don't know where Hannah Green is, but I've got this." She held up a delicate silver chain bracelet from which dangled a shield embossed with a coat of arms. Hero reached out her hand, but the Cyprian closed her fist tight around the bracelet, hiding it from view. You want to see it? You pay for it." "Where did you get it?" "Rose gave it to me." "Gave it to you?" Tasmin Poole smiled. "Let's call it a payment." "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know this bracelet was Rose's?" A sly smile curved the Jamaican Cyprian's wide mouth. "You have my word." Hero's fingers tightened around the strings of her reticule. "I'll give you 10 guineas for the bracelet." 15, said the Jamaican. 12. 13. 13, then. Hero reached into her reticule for the money. She'd have paid twice that. "Now, what can you tell me about Rose?" In one deft motion, Tasmin Poole handed over the bracelet and scooped up the payment. "That'll cost you extra." Chapter 18. In an effort to humour his volatile French cook, Sebastian was picking at an elegant nuncheon of cold salmon in his dining room, when Tom returned with the information that Luke O'Brien, the man named by Ian Kane as Rose's particular customer, was a purchasing agent with clients who ranged from India to the West Indies and Canada. "He buys them everything from kegs of nails and ploughs to furniture and rugs and stuff for their houses, whatever they need. I couldn't find anyone what had anything to say to his discredit. They say he's honest as can be with his clients, yet don't seem to put the squeeze on the merchants neither." "A regular paragon." Sebastian folded his napkin and set it aside. Catching Maury's eye, he said, "Tell Calhoun I'll be needing him right away." The majordomo bowed and withdrew. Tom frowned. "A what?" "A paragon, a model of excellence and perfection." "That sounds like him, all right." Sebastian pushed up from the table. "Which begs the question, doesn't it? What's this paragon doing frequenting some place like the Orchard Street Academy?" "The brown corduroy, don't you think?" said Calhoun, sorting through that portion of Sebastian's wardrobe culled from the second-hand clothing dealers of Rosemary Lane and Monmouth Street. "It will clash hideously with a red waistcoat, but Bow Street runners seem to have a strong predilection for brown corduroy. And you'll like this." The valet turned, a black neckcloth held delicately between two extended fingers. "The individual who sold it to me assured me one could wear it for a month without washing it." Sebastian looked around from rubbing powder into his hair. Between the powder and some judiciously applied theatrical makeup, he had already added 20 years to his appearance. A bolster around his torso would add 20 pounds.
Only a month.
Calhoun laughed.
2, in a pinch.
A few simple questions asked along the riverfront soon brought Sebastian to the outward-bound West Indian docks at the Isle of Dogs, where he found Luke O'Brien overseeing the loading of a shipment of canvas and hemp bound for Barbados. For a moment, Sebastian simply watched him from a distance. The purchasing agent was a well-made man of perhaps 30 or 35, expensively if quietly dressed, his manner easy toward ship's captain and sailor alike. Most of the Bow Street runners Sebastian had met were gruff, bullying men. That was the demeanour Sebastian assumed now, sinking further into the persona as he walked the length of the wind-buffeted dock, so that even his posture and manner of movement altered. It was a trick Cat had taught him when they were both young and in love, and fatally unaware of the common blood that coursed through their veins.
"You're O'Brien, aren't you?" said Sebastian brusquely. "Luke O'Brien?"
The purchasing agent turned. He had light brown hair and hazel eyes that flashed with a lively intelligence.
"That's right. May I help you?"
"My name is Taylor."
Sebastian clasped the lapels of his corduroy coat and threw out his chest.
"Simon Taylor. We're looking into the death of Rose Fletcher."
He'd learned he never actually had to say he was from Bow Street. As long as he looked and acted the part, the assumption simply followed. Sebastian watched as the guarded smile slid away from O'Brien's face and his lips parted on a quick, silent intake of breath. "Dead? Rose is dead? You're certain?"
"We believe she was one of the residents of the Magdalene House when it burned Monday night."
O'Brien turned toward the canal, one hand coming up to cover his mouth, his eyes squeezing shut. He was either devastated or a very, very good actor. It was a moment before he managed to say, "You're certain there's no mistake?" The smell of hot tar and dead fish pinched Sebastian's nostrils.
"We don't think so. When was the last time you saw her?"
O'Brien shook his head, his face still half averted, his voice a torn whisper. "I don't know. 10 days ago, maybe. She didn't tell me she was leaving Orchard Street. I just went there one day, and they said she was gone." He looked around suddenly. "You're quite certain she was at the Magdalene House?"
"It's difficult to know anything with these women, isn't it? Did she ever tell you her real name?"
"No. She didn't like to talk about her life before."
"She never told you anything?"
O'Brien fiddled thoughtfully with the fob at the end of his watch chain. It was of gold, Sebastian noticed, discreet but well-fashioned. The cuffs and collar of his shirt were carefully laundered, his cravat snowy white. No black neckcloths for this agent. "Only that her mother was dead," said O'Brien, staring out over the masts of the ships rocking at anchor off the docks. "From 1 or 2 things she let slip, I gathered the family lived in Northamptonshire. She may have had a couple of sisters, and a brother. I believe he was in the army, but she didn't like to talk about them."
"Northamptonshire? Do you know why she left home?"
O'Brien shook his head. "No."
"And you've no idea why she fled Orchard Street?"
"No. She knew how I felt about her. If she had trouble, why didn't she come to me?" Sebastian said,
"You think her trouble was with Kane?"
O'Brien's jaw hardened. "Maybe. More likely that bloody magistrate."
"What magistrate?"
O'Brien's nostrils flared on a quickly indrawn breath. "Sir William. The bastard knocked her around pretty bad a couple of times.
Ian Kane says he keeps rough customers away from his girls."
"Usually." O'Brien stared against the sun peeking out from behind a cloud to set the wind-ruffled surface of the water to sparkling and flashing.
"But you can't exactly keep a Bow Street magistrate away now, can you?" "Bow Street? You mean Sir William Hadley?"
O'Brien cast him a sideways glance, an unexpectedly hard smile curling his lips.
"That's right. Sir William Hadley himself. So what are you going to do about that, Mr. Bow Street runner?"
Chapter 19. Since Bow Street runners did not in general drive around London in their own carriages, Sebastian had arrived at the Isle of Dogs in a broken-down hackney driven by a gnarled old Jarvey who refused to nudge his mule out of a slow trot. But Sebastian had better luck on the return journey, the hackney swaying along at a satisfying clip as they bounced over the bridge spanning the Limehouse Cut and swung into the long, straight stretch of the new commercial road. It was only by chance that Sebastian glanced back, in time to glimpse the dark-coated man astride a raw-boned grey trotting along behind them. Sebastian had noticed the man before, lounging in the door of a coffee-house near the wharf. It could be a coincidence, of course. Anyone wishing to return to London from the West India Company docks would inevitably travel this same route. Leaning forward, Sebastian spoke to the driver.
"Turn left here. Just wind your way down toward the river."
"Aye, governor," said the Jarvey in surprise. They swung into a narrow lane bordered on one side by an open field, on the other by a long row of new houses. This was a part of the city that was expanding rapidly, transformed by the massive new construction of docks and warehouses that had accompanied the war. They ran past the long rope walks of Sun Tavern fields, and beyond that the spicy fragrance of a cooperage and the blasting heat of a foundry. The dark-coated man on the raw-boned grey kept pace behind them.
"Where now, governor?"
called the Jarvey.
"Pull up at that tavern halfway down the lane."
The tavern was a new two-story brick structure with twin bay windows. As Sebastian paid off the Jarvey, the dark-coated man trotted past, then reined in at the base of the hill overlooking the quay and the warehouses that bordered it. Sebastian entered the tavern and ordered a glass of Daffy. The tavern was crowded with dockers and day labourers who filled the small public room with their voices and the smoke of their pipes and the pungent scent of their hard-working, unwashed bodies. Gin in hand, Sebastian took a seat at an empty table near one of the windows overlooking the street. At the mouth of an alley directly opposite the tavern stood Darkcoat. As Sebastian watched, he lit a white clay pipe, the blue smoke wafting about his face as he drew hard on the stem. He looked to be in his early 30s, a medium-sized man with a crooked nose and a powerful jaw shaded blue by a day's growth of beard. He sucked on his pipe, one shoulder propped against the brick wall of the shop beside him, his eyes narrowed against the smoke and the inevitable reek of the alley. Sebastian set his drink on the table, untasted, and walked out of the tavern. He had to check for a moment and wait while a dray piled high with coal rumbled past. Then he stepped off the footpath into the churned mud of the unpaved lane. Darkcoat turned his head away, his attention seemingly all for the forest of masts that filled this part of the Thames. Sebastian planted himself directly in the man's line of vision. "Who set you to follow me?" The man's eyes widened, but he otherwise managed to keep his face admirably blank as he pushed away from the wall.
"I don't know what the bloody hell you're talking about."
Experience had taught Sebastian to watch a man's hands. He saw the flash of the knife the instant before it slashed up toward his face. Flinging up his left fist, Sebastian knocked the man's forearm with his own in a sweeping block as he took a quick step backward. Too late, Sebastian felt his boot come down on a trampled sludge of rotten cabbage leaves and mud. The leather of his sole skidding dangerously, he slid sideways, one leg shooting out at an awkward angle. Darkcoat pivoted and ran.
Shit.
Catching his balance, Sebastian raced after him, past smashed hogsheads and broken crates, and dustbins of refuse that reeked of fish guts and offal. They erupted out of the end of the alley through an open gate and into a coal yard. Sebastian heard a hoarse shout from one of the workmen as they pelted past, dodging between towering mountains of gleaming blue-black coal, their feet kicking up foul clouds of fine coal dust. The man ahead of Sebastian swerved sideways. Scrambling over the yard wall, he darted out into the traffic of the quay. Dodging lumbering drays and the cracking whip of a bellowing teamster, Sebastian pelted after him. The dark mouth of a warehouse yawned before them, a vast vaulted chamber whose dank air breathed the heady, forbidden fumes of the Bordeaux and the Côte d'Azur. Darkcoat plunged down the stone steps, the string of lamps above flickering with his passing. Sebastian raced after him. Racks of wine casks towered over them, threw long shadows across a cobbled floor, gleaming damp in the wavering lamplight. Somewhere moisture dripped. Wine, or a residue of last night's rain, a slow drip, drip that formed a counterpoint to the slap of boot leather and the rasp of gasping breath. "What the hell do you want from me?" shouted the man, his voice echoing back as he took the stairs at the far end of the wine cave, 2 at a time. "Who hired you?" "Go to hell." At the top of the steps the man veered right. Wary of an ambush, Sebastian slowed. By the time he emerged into the blinding light of the afternoon, the man had disappeared. Breathing hard, Sebastian let his gaze travel over the darkened warehouses around him. A couple of drunken, flaxen-haired sailors stumbled past, warbling a German sea-song. From the distance came the sound of coopers hammering at casks on the quay, the rattle of chains flying up on a crane. And from the warehouse to his right, a thump, like the sound of a body careening into an unseen obstacle. This storeroom was dark, without the string of lanterns that had turned the wine warehouse into a long cavern of dancing shadows. Sebastian entered cautiously, giving his eyes time to adjust. With each step, his feet stuck to the floor as if it were newly tarred. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Years and years of sugar that had leaked through casks to cover the floor, then half-melted in the damp air. From up ahead came that same furtive sucking sound. Then it stopped. Away from the open doorway, the darkness of the warehouse was nearly complete. But Sebastian's senses of sight and sound had always been acute. Wolf-like, Cat used to say. Trying to still his own breathing, he listened, his gaze raking the towering rows of casks. It was the barest hint of sound, cloth brushing against wood. Sebastian whirled just as Darkcoat leapt toward him from atop the nearest stack of kegs. The sudden movement dislodged the casks, toppling them in an avalanche of crushed staves and cascading sugar that swept Sebastian off his feet. He went down hard, his hand scooping up a fistful of sugar he threw in Darkcoat's face as the man lunged toward him, knife in hand. The man swore and staggered back, buying Sebastian enough time to roll to one side and come up onto his knees, a broken stave clutched in both hands. "Yes, son of a bitch," swore the man, charging again. Swinging the stave like a curving club, Sebastian slammed the jagged edge into the man's wrist, sending the knife skittering away into the darkness. "Who hired you?" shouted Sebastian. Whirling, the man took off toward the distant rectangle of light, his boots sliding and sucking in the sugar. Shoving to his feet, Sebastian tore after him. They erupted into the sunlight, covered in a fine dusting of sparkling white crystals. "Englishes," said one of the German sailors, laughing as Sebastian ran past. He could hear the bleating of a goat from a ship out on the river, the raucous cries of seagulls circling over the docks. Heads turned, as, one after the other, the sugar-encrusted men raced up the hill and into the lane. Darkcoat had a good 100-foot lead, and Sebastian couldn't close it. Snatching up his grey's reins on the fly, Darkcoat threw himself into the saddle, the horse shying violently as the man's weight came down hard, and he set his spurs into the animal's sides.
"Son of a bitch,"
said Sebastian. Breathing hard, he leaned forward, his hands on his sugar-dusted knees as he watched the grey's tail disappear with a shivering swish up the lane. Sebastian was in his dressing room, brushing the sugar out of his hair, when Jules Calhoun came in.
"A bath is on the way, my lord."
He held out a sealed missive on a silver tray.
"This arrived while you were out, delivered by a liveried footman."
Sebastian reached for the letter and studied the masculine-looking handwriting of the address. He flipped it over, frowning at the sight of the familiar coat of arms on the seal. The handwriting might be masculine, but it obviously belonged to Miss Hero Jarvis. He broke the seal and unfolded the heavy white page. "My lord, I have new information concerning Rose's identity. I will be visiting the orangery in Kensington Gardens at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Please be prompt, Miss Jarvis."
"Please be prompt," repeated Sebastian, dropping the missive back on the silver tray. "Bloody hell," he thought. "That acorn didn't fall far from its tree."
Calhoun moved about the room, gathering up the Viscount's sugar-dusted disguise.
"You think the man who followed you was working for Ian Kane?"
"It's possible. Kane is the one who sent me after O'Brien in the first place."
Sebastian glanced over at his valet.
"But there may well be more to Mr. O'Brien than meets the eye."
"Would you like me to look into the gentleman, my lord?"
"It might prove interesting."
Calhoun bowed and turned toward the door.
"Oh, and Calhoun, tell Tom to bring my curricle around in half an hour. I think it's time I paid a little visit to Bow Street."
Chapter 20. Dressed once more in his own exquisitely tailored dark blue coat and buckskin breeches, Sebastian drove his curricle to the Brown Bear, the ageing inn in Bow Street that was essentially treated as an extension of the Bow Street magistrate's office.
"Walkham," he told Tom, handing the boy the reins. "We'll be leaving for Kensington as soon as I'm finished here."
Pushing through the inn's smoky public room, Sebastian found Sir William Hadley seated at a booth near the rear, a plate of cold roast beef and a tankard of ale on the worn, stained boards before him.
"You might be interested to know I've discovered the identity of one of the women who was killed Monday night at the Magdalen House," said Sebastian, sliding into the bench opposite the Bow Street magistrate.
Sir William raised his tankard to his lips and drank deeply.
"Now, why the bloody hell would I be interested in that?"
he said, drawing the back of one meaty hand across his wet mouth.
"Because it's someone you know. Rose Fletcher, from the Orchard Street Academy."
Sir William went suddenly still.
"What the bloody hell makes you think I knew her?"
Sebastian gave the man a slow, mean smile.
"Your frequent visits to the Academy are hardly a secret. She was a favourite of yours, was she not?"
Sir William bowed his head over his plate and gave his attention to his beef, shoving a large forkful into his mouth.
"There are those," said Sebastian, "who think you might be the reason Rose fled Orchard Street. You've a nasty reputation for roughing up women, Sir William."
The magistrate's head came up as he swallowed slowly. Eyes narrowing dangerously, he raised one thick finger to point at Sebastian.
"I told you to keep out of this, Devlin. I meant it."
"Under the circumstances, I'm not surprised my interest has made you a trifle, shall we say, nervous?"
Sebastian leaned his back against the panel behind him and crossed his arms at his chest.
"In fact, I find myself wondering where you were on Monday night."
The magistrate's knife clattered against the thick edge of his white ironware plate.
"Not that it's any of your bloody business, but as it happens, I was with the Prime Minister. Next I know, you'll be accusing Percival himself."
Sebastian studied the magistrate's fleshy red face.
"Since you obviously knew the young lady, perhaps you can tell me more about her."
Sir William's lip curled.
"Young lady!"
He pushed his plate away and stood up.
She was a whore, just like all the others, for all her airs and graces. You think I've nothing better to do than waste the afternoon nattering on about some worthless trollop? I've merchants breathing fire because someone's cleaned out a warehouse of prime Russian sables, and a loyal officer of His Majesty's army who seems to have vanished into thin air, and a member of Parliament assaulted in broad daylight on the Strand. Believe me, any one of those incidents is more important than 1,000 dead strumpets.
Sebastian pushed to his feet.
Not to me.
Sir William tore away the napkin he'd tucked into his shirt front and slammed it on the table beside his half-eaten meal.
I warned you to cease this interference in Bow Street's affairs, and I meant it. You might be thick with Sir Henry Lovejoy, but this is Bow Street, not Queen Square. Good day, my lord.
Sebastian watched the portly magistrate push his way toward the tavern's door, just as Bow's bell chimed once, then again. It was 2 o'clock. Kensington Gardens lay to the west of Hyde Park, in an area of town unfashionable enough to ensure that no one of any consequence would be likely to observe the encounter between Miss Jarvis and Viscount Devlin. Leaving Tom walking the chestnuts up and down the lane, Sebastian nodded to the attendant at the gate and continued on foot to where the red brick and glass walls of the orangery rose at the end of an avenue lined with high yew hedges. He found Miss Jarvis smartly dressed in a navy-blue walking dress, topped by a dashing hat, with not 1, but 2 ostrich plumes. She stood as if enraptured by the study of an ornamental planting of lilies. But Sebastian was not deceived. A tall, thin maid, her face tight with discomfort, hovered nearby. "You're late," said Miss Jarvis, twirling her parasol with impatience as he walked up to her. Sebastian opened his eyes wide in mock dismay.
"I am."
To his surprise, a hint of a smile touched her lips. She swung her head away to stare out over a nearby open lawn interspersed with groves of shady trees. "Point taken," she said, and turned to walk along the broad avenue. Sebastian fell into step beside her, the tight-faced maid trailing at a respectful distance.
"So tell me, Miss Jarvis, what have you discovered that is of such vital importance that you felt compelled to arrange this assignation?"
She held her head high, her features remarkably composed. "This is not an assignation, my lord. This is an exchange of information. I have discovered that the woman who gave her name at the Magdalen House as Rose Jones was previously known as Rose Fletcher. She fled a house on Orchard Street."
"The Orchard Street Academy,"
said Sebastian. Miss Jarvis swung to look directly at him. "How did you know that?"
"I went there."
She turned her head as if to study a green damselfly hovering about a nearby wisteria, but not before he saw the shadow of annoyance that flitted across her features. "Oh, and did you discover anything else of significance?" He wasn't about to regale her with the sordid details of his encounters with either Ian Kane or Luke O'Brien.
"It opened up 1 or 2 avenues of inquiry, but nothing of any significance yet."
He turned their steps toward the east, where the long water shimmered blue and sun-dazzled in the distance.
"How precisely did you come to know about the Orchard Street Academy?"
"I spoke to a woman named Tasmin Poole." Sebastian drew up abruptly.
"You what?"
He remembered the tall, long-necked Jamaican he'd encountered in the Academy's tawdry parlour.
"How in the name of all that's holy did you meet her?"
Miss Jarvis continued walking. "I put out word that I was willing to pay for information that would lead me to the woman who originally took refuge at the Magdalen House with Rose. According to Tasmin Poole, Rose fled the Orchard Street Academy with a woman named Hannah Green. Unfortunately, Tasmin is unaware of the woman's current whereabouts." Sebastian stayed where he was.
"Hang on. Exactly how did you put out word?"
She turned to face him, impatient and imperious. "I spoke to some women at a lodging-house in Covent Garden. I'd met with them before in the course of my research. Sebastian watched as the cold breeze plucked a strand of Miss Jarvis's rigidly controlled brown hair and blew it across her cheek. He said,
"You don't even realize what you've done, do you?"
"What I've done? I've discovered the identity of the woman."
"Yes, but at what cost? The men who killed those women at the Magdalene house saw 2 people running away. They shot one in the alley, but they knew one escaped. If they were watching your rendezvous with Tasmin Poole this morning, they now have a good idea who that second woman was. Not only that, but they know you're pursuing an inquiry into what happened, and they're going to think Rose Jones or Rose Fletcher, or whoever she was, told you something."
A slow heat moved up into her cheeks, but otherwise she remained perfectly composed. "I'm well protected."
"I hope so, because the type of people we're dealing with won't take kindly to too close a scrutiny. They've already killed 8 women and burned a house to the ground. You think they won't hesitate to kill you?"
He continued up the path toward the long water, and after a moment she fell in beside him again. She said, "Had you discovered the name of the woman who fled with Rose?"
"No,"
he admitted, glancing sideways at her.
"Did Tasmin Poole tell you why the 2 women ran away from Orchard Street?"
"She said she didn't know, but she had this." Reaching into her reticule, Miss Jarvis held up a short length of silver chain. "She said Rose gave it to her as payment for something." Sebastian reached out to take the chain and cradle it in his gloved palm. It was a bracelet, small and delicate, with a single round medallion. He remembered his sister Amanda having something similar as a child.
"It's a child's bracelet," he said, glancing up at the woman beside him. "How do you know this really belonged to Rose Fletcher?"
"I recognized the coat of arms on the medallion." He flipped over the small medallion to study the helm with 3 eagles' heads.
"The Fairchilds," he said.
He looked up to find her watching him.
"You do realize that either Tasmin Poole or Rose Fletcher could have acquired this bracelet in any one of 100 different ways?"
"Of course I realize that," she said, with ill-disguised indignation. "But the coincidences are more than intriguing."
"Coincidences?"
"Lord Fairchild has a daughter named Rachel, who made her come out just last season. Her betrothal was announced in May, not long before she supposedly retired to the family estates in Northamptonshire for health reasons. But there are rumours that Miss Fairchild is not in Northamptonshire. There are rumours that she ran away." Sebastian rubbed the pad of his thumb over the bracelet's delicate silver links. According to Luke O'Brien, Rose's family was from Northamptonshire. He said,
"Why would she take this with her, of all things? Can't be worth much."
"Perhaps it was given to her by someone she loved. I don't know. But Tasmin told me something else significant. She said Rose, or Rachel, or whatever her name is, was terrified someone would find her. Tasmin thought it might have been her family, but she wasn't certain."
Sebastian said, "If Rose was Rachel Fairchild, and she came out last season, then why didn't you recognize her when you met her at the Magdalene house?"
Miss Jarvis shrugged. "I may have seen her at a ball, but if so, I don't recall it. She wasn't the type of young woman one would notice in a crush, and I seldom attend Almack's assemblies these days." At 25, Miss Jarvis was virtually an ape leader. He held up the bracelet.
"You bought this?"
"Yes, with the promise of £20 if Tasmin Poole should discover the current whereabouts of Hannah Green." When he remained silent, she said with some impatience, "At least we've a new avenue of inquiry to pursue." Sebastian raised one eyebrow.
"We, Miss Jarvis?"
She stared back at him. "That's right."
"What precisely do you intend to do? Go to Almack's and offer £20 to anyone who can furnish you with the whereabouts of Miss Rachel Fairchild?"
The colour was back in her cheeks, only this time he suspected it was a flush of annoyance.
Miss Jarvis wasn't yet as good at controlling her emotions as her father.
"No," she said evenly, "but I can make a call upon Lady Sewell."
Who?
"Georgina, Lady Sewell. Before her marriage she was Miss Fairchild, Rachel Fairchild's elder sister. I can't help but wonder, if Rachel ran away from the Fairchilds' house on Curzon Street, why didn't she seek refuge with her sister?"
Rather than in a brothel? It is an interesting question.
Sebastian frowned, remembering what Luke O'Brien had told him about Rose's family.
I think she might have had 2 sisters and a brother in the army.
Sebastian knew that Lord Fairchild had at least one son, Cedric. He'd served with Sebastian in the Peninsula.
Is there a younger sister as well?
He asked aloud. "I don't know," said Miss Jarvis, shifting her parasol to keep the faint sun off her face. Sebastian stared off across the sparkling surface of the long water toward Hyde Park. What he needed, he realized, was someone intimately familiar with every hint of gossip and scandal attached to the Fairchilds in the last 50 years. Someone like his aunt. "I think the information we've gained was worth whatever minimal risk I might have incurred," said Miss Jarvis, reaching to take the bracelet from his hand. Sebastian closed his fist around the chain.
"I might be able to use this," he said. "Leave it with me."
He expected her to argue with him, but she did not. Looking into her frank, intelligent grey eyes, he had the disconcerting realization that she didn't argue because she knew precisely what he planned. She knew that as soon as he'd visited his gossipy Aunt Henrietta, he meant to confront Lord Fairchild himself. In fact, she was counting on it.